As per usual, folks, let me ask you a question. Anything that you are losing your minds over thus far? I always like to start off the day. Jacob, you were just ready to push that button. I saw you. You were just like, ask the question, Seth. Ask the question. I'm gonna say it. What you got?
Yep. I was super ready.
Okay, hold on. Let me record.
Recording in progress.
Now, ask the question.
Okay, so I feel like the math and everything, I feel like I was doing decent and keeping up with it. But there came a question on the practice test. And you can tell me to shut up and you're going to answer this later because that's probably the case. But the last question on the practice sheet that we have online, it started talking about here, let me pull up the actual question. Hold on. I just want to make sure that I'm not talking silly here. Okay, can you still hear me?
Mm-hmm.
After I exited the page, okay. So the question was, a house with a market value of $50,000 is located in a city where the assessed value is 60% of the market value. The country rate is 1.45 per hundred, and the city rate is $2 per hundred. What is the annual property tax on the home? Was that a trick question? Is that 60% important, or do we have to configure that in? And if so, I did configure it in, and I just kind of want to know if I did it right or not. So can you maybe walk through that problem?
Yeah, let me share my screen here. Now this is just the slides from yesterday, and I will pull up the problem that you are referring to. So let's talk about this. Okay, this is on one of the little homework assignments outlined in the program. And so, as Jacob said, it reads, a house with a market value of $50,000 is located in a city where the assessed value is 60% of the market value. Now, you're going to see this worded several different ways, but let me just make sure you understand what's happening here. I told you in North Carolina, we base your taxes off of the ad valorem value or assessed value, okay? The tax assessor has their own appraisal process, and we are charging you the tax rate based on 100% of that amount. In some municipalities, they don't do it the same way. In some states, they don't do it the same way. And so that's where this is what we call an equalization factor comes into play. So what they're going to say is, well, we're not going to assess the properties, but what we're going to do is we're going to take a look at like the last thing they sold for, and we're going to make you pay taxes based off 60% of it or 80% of it or 120% of it, because it could go bigger. So some states elect to not have their own assessments, and they will base it on a percentage, either higher or lower, and some other metric like the market price. So this was important in this question. And so you would not use this market value. You are going to be calculating taxes based off 60% of that market value. So anytime you've got this equalization factor, this is where percentages come in. I was kind of talking about basic math functionality yesterday. You can say 50,000 and you can convert 60% to 0.6, or you can let the calculator do it for you, times 60%. And so the taxes are based on $30,000 in this scenario. Now, there are other, practice ones that you could see. You could see a greater equalization factor. So if it had said something like it's based on 120%, well, that's just times 1.2, right? So at that point, it's 50,000 times 120%, because sometimes it's bigger, and so your taxes would be based on $60,000 at that point. So it's called an equalization factor, and some states use it. It's typically associated with like an equalization factor from the market value or market price. And then in North Carolina, I told you we just have the assessed value, and we're basing our taxes off 100% of the assessed value. But because the math is all a national concept, you will absolutely see equalization factors potentially on the exam.
Okay, awesome. So I think I did it right then, but I just wanted to make sure.
Yep. Good call.
I sat there and I thought about it long and hard.
Yeah, hold on. Is that the answer that you posted in the group me last night?
Yes.
I didn't get I looked at it. I didn't get a chance to respond to it. But that, if I'm remembering correctly, that number was correct that you posted.
Yes, I mean, it was for this question. Can I say my answer? I don't want to.
Yeah, it was 1960. Is that what it was?
No, it was $1,035.
Okay, 1035. Yeah, I'm just going off of memory. There's several different questions that just burn in my brain the answers, and so one of the answers to one of these questions is 1960, but 1035 is probably right because that one is burned into my brain as well as many times as I've looked at this worksheet.
1960 is the answer number 2.
See, told you. I told you it was the answer somewhere. Thanks, Stephanie. That's pretty bad. I have.
It is. Yeah, no, it is.
I have no answers in front of me. I've just looked at this worksheet so many times that these answers are just like burned into my brain somewhere. So, yeah, there you go. Good deal. Cool. Good question. Any other questions on anything before we kick off this fun-filled day of learning? Cool. Well, in that case, by the way, in case anybody was curious, the worksheet that we're looking at, if you haven't seen it yet, is this tax calculations under property taxation and assessment within this little thing. So, yesterday, we got into some more in-depth conversations on the different types of encumbrances. Okay, remember, encumbrance is a type of limitation on the property. We discussed financial encumbrances like liens. Liens will have a much greater discussion down the road in the financing chapter and a little bit more in upcoming sections. We talked about physical encumbrance like CC&Rs, deed restrictions, things of that nature. Let me just remind you, folks, so we're going to talk about more about these in a minute as well. But when I say deed restrictions, okay, there are public land use controls which deal with the government, and there are private land use controls which deal with, rules imposed by private property owners. Affects only a couple people or one person would be deed restrictions. Affects all people would be kind of like the public land use controls. And that'll make more sense as we dive into this a little bit deeper. And so if somebody restricted something to only being a horse farm, that would be a deed restriction. That's an encumbrance. If somebody said you can't have chickens, that would be a deed restriction. It'd be an encumbrance. If somebody said that you could not put a manufactured home on a given piece of property, that would be a deed restriction. That would be an encumbrance. And so we also talked about other encumbrances, encroachments. What's an encroachment, folks?
When you build on somebody else's property.
When you build onto somebody else's property, right? Your improvements go over the property line. Doesn't matter what it is. A fence, a sidewalk, a patio, a pool, a house. They're all bad, but some of them are easier to remedy than others. And so those would be an encumbrance because they can be sometimes so bad that nobody even wants those properties anymore. The other big physical encumbrance we talked about was an easement. What is an easement?
The right to use someone.
The right to use somebody else's property, right? Not ownership, but the right to use. I get to drive over this. I get to walk across this. I get to whatever it may be. And we had two main types of easements that are going to be testable. What were they?
Easement and growth, which is property in person.
And?
Easement appearance, rules with the land, I believe.
Pertinent easement, or an easement appurtenant, which involves two parcels of property. And remember that word appurtenant means runs with the land. And so it would be lot A and lot B. And so whoever owns lot A and lot B is subject to that easement. And remember, there is always one giving the benefit and one getting the benefit. What do we call the one giving the benefit?
Servient?
The servient tenement. And the one that is getting the benefit? Dominant tenement. Dominant tenement. There you go. So then we moved on after encumbrances, and we got into a slightly newer topic now where we're talking about taxation and assessment. And so we talked about North Carolina and the Machinery Act, and North Carolina having what's called a mandatory octennial reappraisal. What does mandatory octennial reappraisal mean?
Every 8 years. Every
Your property is
valuation.
There you go. Every county has to reassess the values at least every 8 years, right? That is mandatory. They do not have an option. Every 8 years they have to do it. Everybody's not on the same 8-year cycle, but it does have to happen every 8 years. And then I told you that they could reevaluate it how often? Say it again.
Every 4 years.
4 years. The possible horizontal reassessment every 4 years, meaning across the board, the whole municipality. They can't just pick and choose certain areas or certain neighborhoods, but they could do it every 4 years. Now, here's the other big thing that you could see. Folks, how often can the tax rate change?
Annually.
Every stinking year. That's right. Every stinking year. And so your tax bill could change every stinking year. And so then we got into the discussion on calculating these tax bills. And I told you North Carolina uses the per 100 rate. And so in this example that we left off with last night, when we looked at it, the question was the assessed value of a property outside the city limits is $246,000. County tax rate is 89 cents per 100. City tax rate is 74 cents per 100. And remember, it's very important to pay attention to the question because it's outside of the city limits. So we need to know we ignore the city taxes because you always, always, always pay county taxes. But you would only pay the city tax rate if you were in the city limits as well. And then you'd have to pay both. So in this instance, remember I told you there's more than one way to do this. But my preferred way is I like to take that per 100 rate and convert it to a per dollar rate. So 89 cents per 100, if you divide by 100, that converts it to a per dollar rate. And so now you owe the tax assessor 0.0089 cents per dollar, and you can just multiply it by your assessed value of $246,000. Now, the other thing that we learned last night was that you really, really have to read the question because the real question is, what is the monthly tax bill? In other words, how much would you owe each month if we wanted to break it up into that interval of payments? And so we needed to divide by 12 to get us our answer. Now, let me just remind you about the correlation between, I'm going to move my calculator over here. Actually, I'm going to minimize my calculator. The correlation between the T-bars, as we call them, and linear equations. Folks, all these tax rates is really, I mean, it's the same as like a percentage, right? Because we're multiplying it by these small little decimals, and so we're just really breaking it down into a smaller piece. So there's always the whole, let me get my pen here, the whole number times the rate times the whatever you want to call it, and that's going to give you your part. Now, in this case, that is the assessed value times the tax rate gives you the tax bill. Well, you can do that in a linear equation as well. So what we did was 246,000 times our 0.0089 once we converted it. By the way, folks, you're always going to be allowed to have a calculator, but when you're doing these conversions, dividing by 100, you just move the decimal 2 zeros over. So you don't even need a calculator to convert it to a per dollar rate. And so this equals your annual tax bill. Now, folks, I'm telling you, the only reason people started teaching T-bars is because people freaked out when we said the word linear equation and basic algebra. But your brain knows that this times a rate is going to equal a percentage, a part, a piece. And so all you have to do is always write out the question in a linear format. But let's say that I didn't give you the rate, right? Let's say that I asked you to kind of reverse engineer the problem. And I said, okay, well, here was the assessed value. Here was the tax bill. What was the tax rate? Now you have this unknown. And this is the most trivial form of algebra, where you just remove the numbers or move all the numbers to one side so you figure out the value of your unknown variable. So if you divide by 246,000 on this side, you would have to divide by 246,000 on this side. And now what you're left with, you negated that out. Your rate equals this number, 2,189.40 divided by 246,000 for the assessed value. All the T-bar is a visual representation, because if you put this stuff into a T, and this is what you don't have, if you've got a number on top and one number on the bottom, you go down the t-bar, you're dividing. So you see how it's the exact same thing? 2,189 divided by this. It's the exact same thing as just moving around a linear equation. It's just a visual representation of when to do it based on the numbers you have and don't have. Now, I don't care which way you use as long as you know what you're doing. But I'm telling you, if you're comfortable with the linear equation, you will not have to remember a single formula in this class. You won't. Because it will all be commonplace in your head because you know the basic linear function for the math that you've been doing for the past, 10, 15, 20, 30 years, depending on the people in this class, right? So let's take this a step further, okay? And I gave you a mini lesson on this last night before we ended, okay? In North Carolina, we use this per 100 rate. Remember, it's so simple because you look at it and what it's saying is this is how much you owe per $100 worth of assessed value. So when we give a per 100 rate of 89 cents, you owe 89 cents per $100 of assessed value. Well, the other unit is a mill rate. A mill rate is now just saying how much you owe per 1,000. That's it. That is the only thing that's changed. The math is the same. The basic functionality is the same. The calculations are the same. It's just now instead of being per $100 of assessed value, it's per $1,000 worth of assessed value. And so remember what I told you. You will be asked to convert a mill rate to a per 100 rate, a per 100 rate to a dollar rate to a mill rate. So here's where I will remind you how to do this the easiest way. Since a mill rate is per 1,000, I want you to remember what you would have to do to a 1,000 in a calculator to turn it into 1. How would you convert a per 1,000 rate to a dollar rate?
Divided by 1,000.
Divided by 1,000, because 1,000 goes into itself one time. So if we had a 5 mils, we would divide that by 1,000, and that converts it to a per dollar rate. Or just like before I told you, because there are 3 zeros in 1,000, you can just move the decimal 1, 2, 3 zeros, and you have converted it to a per dollar rate. Now, if I told you to take this per dollar rate and convert it back to a per 100 rate, what would you do?
Times 100.
Multiply it by 100, and now we've got this as a per 100 rate. And then if I said convert it back to a per 1,000 rate or mill rate, what would you do?
Divide it, right?
No, not per, well, what would you do in a calculator to take 100 to 1,000?
Oh, divide. No, well,
100
no, I would
times multiply times 10.
Multiply by 10. There you go. There you go. So times 10 takes us back to the mill rate we started at. That's it. Because you're always just thinking about what would you need to do in the calculator to take whatever rate it is to the other rate. So 100 times 10 is 1,000. So if you've got a per 100 rate and you want to convert it to a per 1,000 rate or a mill rate, right, it's just multiplied by 10. If it's a mill rate you want to take to a per dollar rate, divide by 1,000. If it's a per 100 rate you want to take to a per dollar rate, divide by 100. This is just converting back and forth, and you will potentially be asked to do this. So I just told you this. You can easily just, without even dividing, you can just go 1, 2, 3 decimals to the left and convert it that way as well. But let me give you some examples on this. And I don't really like showing you the T-bar because this, I mean, yeah, this works, but it's just better to understand exactly what you're doing as I just said it. So let's take a look at a practice here. What is the monthly tax bill for a property which recently sold for $452,000 with an assessed value of $427,000 in Asheville, where the total tax rate is $1.16 per 100? Now, folks, before we do anything, I want you to analyze this question and tell me a couple things.
It's monthly, so we have to divide it by 12 at the end.
There's a very big piece. That's important. I'm gonna underline that.
And, yeah, and what it's asking for is, well, it's not what it's asking for, but we need to do it based off the assessed value. The sold value is a number in there that doesn't matter.
There you go. That's exactly right, folks. We have given you extra information to be mean and hateful and nasty, okay? Doesn't matter what it's sold for. Taxes are based on the assessed value. So you need to know that you're calculating taxes based off of this. Now, this is still just a per 100 rate. We haven't done an example with a mill rate yet. So work this out for me, folks. Tell me what you get. So let's work it out. You've got your assessed value. You've got your one rate. We didn't try to screw with you there. So it is $1.16 per 100. As I said, a couple different ways you can do it, but I'm going to take the $1.16, which is a per 100 rate. I'm going to divide by 100 to convert it to a per dollar rate. So you owe the tax assessor 0.0116 per dollar of assessed value. So I can multiply that by our assessed value of $427,000, which gives us an annual tax bill of $4,935. But what we want to know is the monthly tax bill. So divided by 12, because there are 12 months in a year, would be $412.77. Now, do understand, folks, it'll never come down to rounding. If you look at some of those like homework assignments, the math packet, those are all based off of rounding to the third decimal place. When it comes down to it, I just like to just use real numbers. You know, I don't ever really leave it as 0.000000. I stop at actual pennies, right? 2 decimal places is typically the way I do it. But it will never come down to rounding on the test, I promise. There will always be an answer close enough to you. You know, we're not going to give you one rounded and one not, except for a very important concept that I'm going to teach you here in a little bit that we will screw with you on. But most questions are never going to come down to rounding. Everybody see how we work that out? Oops. So here is, let me back up here. Here is the pretty answer. Now I'm going to pull up your little thing again here because I want to just give you an opportunity to do a practice with mill rates, and I don't have them in the slides currently, or I think maybe I hid them. But if you look, you've got these math homework assignments, but if you look down here in this mathematics section, you have the entire math packet. So a lot of the homework is just broken off of this. And then this is a supplemental resource for you to see all the different types of math you could be exposed to on the test. And so, you know, if you do all of them, like this is, you know, the one that's in there is like the first assignment, and then it goes on from there. But there's some extra problems to work through. So let me show you what I mean. I want to find a mill rate one. Let's do, and some of you may have already done one of these in the homework, and that's okay, but I want you to just, everybody have an opportunity to work on one. Yeah, some of you have already worked this one out on your homework, so you can just give me the answer. But because I don't have one of the slides, everybody take a second and try to work on this mill rate one for me. If you haven't gotten to the homework yet, it's okay. It'll just make it super easy whenever you go and do it. So number 3, let me circle it so you know which one. That one.
You want both answers?
Yeah. There you go. So real quick, let's work through it and make sure you're all comfortable. This is not the only time we will do tax math, but I have to let you know, this is number 1, the easiest math in the entire curriculum. Number 2, this is typically a starting point for more in-depth math questions that you will potentially see, because we need this in order to do math prorations. Okay, math prorations is where we kind of divide the bill between the parties, and I may give you some insight into that today, but we're not going to actually formally learn it yet because I don't want to freak you out with that, and we got so much other stuff to go over. But let's just work this one out really quick. So a property is assessed at $64,410. The county tax rate is 8.9 mils per dollar. And don't let that confuse you. That per dollar shouldn't be there. It's just 8.9 mils. So that's $8.90 per thousand is what it should read as in your head. What would be the amount of the annual tax bill, and then what would the monthly payment to your escrow account be? And I'll explain escrow accounts more later. But your 8.9 mils is per 1,000, so you owe the tax assessor $8.90 per 1,000. But if you just take that and divide by 1,000, you've converted it to your per dollar rate. Per dollar rate times your assessed value of $64,410. Oops. 410 gives you your annual tax bill of $573.25, and then divided by 12 to give you your monthly $47.78. Everybody feeling okay-ish on these? Super reassuring when I ask if everybody's feeling okay-ish, and everybody's like, I'm not shaking my head, but I'm also not going to nod either, you know? I'm going to sit completely still. Well, it takes time, right?
I feel good about these.
Good. So we may get into some more math. I'm going to be completely honest with you. We're not going to spend a super huge portion of time on any math concept, and I'll tell you why. Most of them are percentages and pretty straightforward, and they just require you to practice them to get more used to them. But then the other ones that are more complicated, I'm going to be honest with you folks, and this is going to sound terrible, but for those of you who are not good at math, just take the L on it. I just can't stress that enough, because there's no point in you wasting ungodly amounts of hours to learn a super complicated math concept, because there is like one-ish really complicated one that you could see on the test, but you may see one question on it. So it's not something that I really feel that we should take a whole lot of time on, because it's still just 1 point on the test, right? It's just one question. So I'll teach it all to you, but we just can't spend a whole lot of time practicing the math in the class. That's why we have this math packet to work on outside of class, and supplemental videos and things of that nature. So let's move into the next kind of subcategory here, and I've already given you a little bit of insight into the things we're about to talk about, and we are going to introduce another very simplistic math concept in this section. So now we're just kind of moving into legal descriptions and the transfer of title. Now folks, legal descriptions, Let me just give you a rundown of what to expect in this chapter, all right? Can you imagine that I told you that I was going to sell you 123 Main Street? Well, folks, do you think there might be more than 123 Main Street in a given municipality or in close proximity to another one? Main Street, Martin Luther King Jr. Boulevard, West Street, Palm Street. Okay, there is like 10 billion of the same street names all over the place. And so I want you to picture this. If I told you I was selling you 123 Main Street, and you thought I meant 123 Main Street, this mansion on the hill, okay, and you paid me $1.2 million for it, and at the end of the transaction, I hand you your keys, and you go over there to that mansion on the hill, and your keys don't work. And I drive past you, and I say, "What are you doing, stupid? That's not the house you bought. You bought 123 Main Street on the other side of town. You know, the little dilapidated tiny home with the rabid raccoons living inside there? That's the one you just bought. You didn't know that? Wouldn't that suck, folks? And so the point is, informal references is what we call the street address. Yes, that's what we all use, but it's not adequate for a legal transfer, a legal document. Contracts and deeds need to be more specific. So that's what I mean by legal descriptions. Ways of identifying a property that there's no question about which property we're referring to. And of course, that goes hand in hand with the transfer of title, because when is that the most important? When we're transferring ownership. So there's no confusion. So excise tax is the other math that you're going to get introduced to. Now, I'm going to warn you about something, folks. Not only do you have this issue of, oh, well, maybe you're not good at math, maybe you are, but there is a lot of concepts throughout this class that sound extremely similar. And you have to be able to keep them separate in your minds. If you confuse real property taxes with excise tax, you are screwed. Okay? They are vastly different concepts. Just like we have 3 different types of insurances that you have to be aware of in this class and know which ones I'm talking about. We've got homeowners insurance, we've got mortgage insurance, and we've got title insurance. All extremely different. So there's a lot of things that sound similar that you have to differentiate in your minds. So let's get into these, okay? We're going to talk about excise tax. We're going to talk about transferring title. We're going to talk about the legal descriptions. Those are all the really big things we're going to hit on in this section. So let's start with the legal descriptions. Yet again, testable, but not a crazy amount of questions on these legal descriptions, okay? Now, I'm going to introduce one, and you're going to hate it, but the good news is I don't have to teach it nearly as in-depth as I used to, because there used to be math in regard to one of these legal concepts. There's no math in regard to it anymore, so yay us. But you're still not going to like the concept. So when I use the term legal description, there are 4-ish, depending on how you break them up, that we need to discuss, okay? There's what we call the meets and bounds legal description. There is the government rectangular survey system. I'll also just call the government survey system. That's the one you're going to hate. There is what we call reference to a recorded plat and reference to a recorded deed. Now, these are grouped together, but I would argue that they're different because the plat maps is also called the lot and block method. So it's its own methodology. And then reference to a recorded plat is kind of a similar concept. And I'll give you an example of that in a second. But it's just basically referencing something in the public record, that register of deeds that I kind of talked about yesterday or the day before. So the street address is not enough to convey clear title. The tax address also not enough to convey clear title. We need something a little more substantial. So let's start with the meets and bounds method, folks. The meets and bounds is the primary method that is still used today in the original 13 colonies, okay? As we came over, as you might imagine, this came from over in England and Europe and all these places. They utilize it, and it came over here. And as you know, we populated the United States and we had the original 13 colonies. It's still technically alive and well in, the states that were the original 13 colonies. Now, that history portion is not going to be testable, just something to know. And then a lot of other states utilize this government rectangular survey system. Now, when we're talking about meets and bounds, there is just a lot of verbiage that you'll have to be able to identify. I mean, that's really what it comes down to. You will not have to write a meets and bounds legal description. You will not have to do anything super in-depth with it, but you're going to have a general knowledge of what it is and what terminology is associated with it. And so meets and bounds takes a very identifiable point. We call that the point of beginning. And then it uses what we refer to as calls to say which direction you go and how far. And so that's where the meets and bounds comes into it. Meets is the distance, bounds is the direction. So it would be something like starting at the corner of this street and this street, thence go 143 feet southwest, 116 degrees. That would be a call. And so you would go that direction and you would stop at that point, and that's typically referred to as a monument. And then you would have another call that goes in another direction. And so when you read this, it's verbiage. And this verbiage would identify that point. It would tell you which direction to go, which direction to go, which direction to go, which direction to go, and then it would end back at the point of beginning. It always starts and ends at the same point. It closes the parcel of land. Now, it is considered legally adequate as a legal description as long as a surveyor can identify this piece of property, not us. Folks, this is way outside of the scope of what most people can do. Listen, I was a Boy Scout for a very long time, and even if you gave me a compass, I probably still couldn't figure out which direction to go. I don't even know. I'm going to have to... hey, Google, how does a compass work? Right? I don't remember that. We're soft in 2024, right? My car tells me which direction I'm driving. I don't know. Well, yes, I know how they work, Jacob. I'm just saying.
Soft. You might be soft, but I ain't soft, Seth.
Yeah, that's right. Misty took her pre-licensing class back in 1997. Okay, I'm kidding. It was 2000. I remember.
2000.
It was 2000. I was kidding. I just took a step further. Back in my day, we walked uphill in the snow both ways to get to pre-licensing class, and we had to use a compass to find our way. Okay, that's right. I'm with you. So it's something a surveyor would have to be able to find. Now, you're going to need to know the term monuments and markers, point of beginning, meets and bounds. Meets is distance, bounds is direction. All of these are things you're going to have to identify. So what would a test question look like? The type of legal description that utilizes a point of beginning, calls, and bounds, would be a meets and bounds legal description. They also use minutes and degrees in some instances, right? So they'll use minutes and degrees as references for distance and things of that nature. I'm going to show you an example of this in just a second. So a surveyor writes this. A surveyor would have to be able to follow it, and you have to know the terminology. And as I said, it will always kind of, using words, spell out a starting point, and then use calls to tell you how far and which direction you go, and it will end up closing it. It always starts and ends at the same point. And these are still alive and well today. They still happen. Now, as you might imagine, folks, because this is just a list of words on a piece of paper, it's not a picture like this. It's words. A very large piece of property can have in excess of 30 pages worth of meets and bounds description. I mean, it can really just get absolutely ridiculous. So this is just a little thing to tell you how it measures clockwise. Point of beginning has to go back. Failure to close the description is imperfect because that's kind of the whole point, is they close it up. Now, hang tight. I'm going to show you what one actually looks like in a minute when I reference something else. But this is the generalization. These terminologies, these are the things that you have to know. Once upon a time, monuments were silly things like, trees, streams, intersections, rocks. But as time goes on, those can sometimes be moved and become obsolete. Wouldn't change the boundaries per se, but it would make it potentially harder to find them. And then understand today, when a surveyor goes out and surveys a piece of property, we don't rely on these random items anymore. They put an iron stake in the ground. So they actually use metal detectors to find the iron stakes next time. Now, because we're talking about land, I am going to use this as an opportunity to kind of teach you a number that you have to know. And this is for math, and this is for the test. There are certain things that I can give you, crazy concepts and explanations on, and then there's other things that you just have to memorize. Okay? And so, because we're talking about lots, let me bring something into this, folks. How do we typically refer to the size of a lot? What terminology do we use?
Acres.
Acreage. Well, part of this class is understanding how to convert acres to square feet and square feet to acres. Because when we get into some of the math, it's going to be what we call area calculations. Area of a piece of property, area of a home. Now, if we're measuring a home, we're fine with leaving it as square feet. If we're measuring a parcel of land, we're fine with leaving it as acres. But sometimes we're given not those perfect measurements. And so let's say if I told you that this lot was this many feet by this many feet, just like you see here, 200 feet by 150 feet. Well, let me introduce a quick little math concept, folks. If you don't remember how to calculate area of a rectangle, it is just length times width. So in this particular instance, it's 200 feet times 150 feet, which tells us that this piece of property is 30,000 square feet. Here's the problem. How many acres is that? Don't actually answer that if you know. It's a rhetorical question. You shouldn't know unless you've taken this class before. And if you know and you've never taken this class before, you're a weirdo. Just leave.
That's not fair.
Yeah, I was waiting for it, Stephanie. I was waiting for it, Stephanie, because technically, yes, okay. That was a little harsh. I'm sorry. You may need it for other reasons other than this class, and I apologize. I'm just picking on y'all. Folks, here's the deal. You've got to memorize a very magical number. This is the first, absolute memorization thing, okay? There are 43,560 square feet in 1 acre. 43,560. Now that is just a weird number. So here's a little mnemonic to help you remember it. 1 acre is 43,560 square feet. Now, historically, we help you memorize it as 4 little old ladies driving 35 miles per hour in a 60 mile per hour zone. But in order to be a little less ageist and discriminatory, I turned it into gold ladies, okay? Everybody knows the Golden Girls. So 4 gold ladies going 35 in a 60. 43,560. That is how many square feet are in 1 acre. So in that last example, folks, it was 30,000 square feet. So what you do is you say, okay, well, how many times does 43,560 go into this number? So you divide by 43,560. And you've just converted it to acres. So that last piece of property we just looked at was 0.69 acres. Monica, I agree with you. They do look younger than I remember as well. I'm sure this was one of the earlier promo photos for when the show started. So that's probably why they look so much younger. And I don't remember if the pop culture was true, but I remember hearing that, I think, what was her name, Estelle Getty? She was younger than I think Dorothy was, but she played, her mother, and they just really made her up. And yeah, I think she was actually.
She's the youngest of all 4 of them.
Yeah, see, there you go. So, but she did, man, those St. Olaf stories with Rose, and then the Shady Pines with her. Oh, my childhood is unlocked. They were my 2 favorites. Sophia and Rose were the best. Yeah. Anyway, so that's how you remember it, okay? So conversely, if I said you had a 3-acre piece of property, well, knowing this now, you could say, well, 3 acres times 43,560, and you could convert that to square feet. So we're going to practice this some more in a moment. I just wanted to go ahead and introduce this number, okay? 1 acre equals 43,560. That's something you got to memorize. It is absolutely critical for your test to know this. So we'll circle back around to some more calculations math, but I thought now is a good time to introduce it. So let's talk about everybody's least favorite legal description. It's called the Government Survey System, also sometimes just referred to as the Government Rectangular Survey System or just the Rectangular Survey System. Here's a mini history lesson. Once upon a time, a man named Thomas Jefferson, maybe you've heard of him, decided that when we were colonizing or moving, expanding out west, that maybe we should have a more structured and standardized methodology for land ownerships and legal descriptions. And so he came up with this government survey system. So before we go any further, when I explain it to you and you hate it, just think in your mind, thanks, Tom, okay, Mr. Jefferson. So if you look in this picture and you fly out west, this is what you see when you look out of an airplane window. It is on a grid.
Like Utah.
Yeah, there you go. It is on a grid pattern. It is on a grid pattern, okay? And so this entire system is based off of grids. It's what we call principal meridians and baselines. Kind of like longitude and latitude, right? There's vertical lines and there's horizontal lines, and we use those as reference points. So this is mainly used west of the Mississippi River. Texas doesn't use this, even though Texas is very grid-like. Texas actually uses the meets and bounds method still, but they were built on grids out there. So let me show you the picture first, and I'll come back to this section, or this page right here, okay? I want you to visually see it. It helps you understand it. So this is what it would look like. And yet again, it's kind of like an X and Y axis back in the day. What you got, Jacob?
Okay, this is a slightly off-topic question about the history behind the government survey system. So you said Thomas Jefferson came up with that? Okay. I'm from Utah, and so everything's like that there, right? The whole grid system, except the Mormons take credit for it.
The Mormons take credit for a lot of things.
So that I thought that was the Mormons, not Thomas Jefferson.
It was Thomas Jefferson. Yeah. Now, I mean, they could have been some of the early adopters out there before Thomas Jefferson. You know, I don't really know the history behind it. The Mormons take credit for a lot of things, and then Mormons actually have a very unique history. Did you grow up Mormon, Jacob?
Yeah. I grew up with that being like my surrounding. I'm personally not, but that's what I grew up with.
And I don't feel weird asking you that question because that's how I grew up also. So, yeah. All right. Just not from Utah, but all my friends went and did missions and went to Utah and did all those different things. So, yeah. When you actually look at the full history of Mormons, it's very interesting. Very interesting. So, but yeah, maybe they took credit, but it was Thomas Jefferson. So, if you look at these principal meridians and baselines, okay, there are these main vertical lines, we call them principal meridians, and then there are these baselines. Now, folks, I want you to always look at this like a compass, okay? Even though I admitted to you that I just probably don't even remember how to use a compass, we all know what a compass looks like on a map. Up is north, down is south, right is east, left is west. We live on the East Coast. California is on the West Coast. New York and Canada are north. Miami is south. Everybody cool with that statement? And so when you're looking at these meridians and baselines, they are then what we call range lines that come off the center of the principal area. And it's just like an X and Y axis. This is basically 0 in the middle, and you can either have positive or negative, but instead of positive and negative, it's east and west. So you can go up 1 range, 2 range, 3 range. You can go right or east, 1 range, 2 range, 3 range. You can go south, right, the same. And every single one of these range lines is 6 miles. And so when you look at one, for instance, right here, this is a 6 mile by 6 mile square. Now, folks, that's actually very large, 6 mile by 6 mile square. And so that is what's called a township. Every single one of the blocks within here is a township, and it is a 6 mile by 6 mile square. Now, when you look, we're going to erase everything but the north, south, east, and west. What they do is they reference a very specific township. In this case, there is this one right here that we're looking at, which is 4 ranges to the east and 3 ranges to the north from this principal meridian and baseline. And so when you are talking about this township, you would refer to this as Township 3 North, Range 4 East. Now, we would then go on to identify of which principal meridian and baseline, but we don't need to go that in depth in this class because we went up 1, 2, 3 north, and we went 1, 2, 3, 4 to the east. So this is Township 3 North, Range 4 East. If I was to come down here, this would be Township 2 South, Range 2 West. Because it went down 1, 2 south, and then 1, 2 west. If I went over here, this would be Township 2 North, Range 3 West. So, I'm not entirely sure exactly what types of questions you could see about this. You could, I'm going to give you some examples of what I think you could see. The good news is there's no longer any math based on this, is what we've been told by the North Carolina Real Estate Commission. I hope that's true. But let's take this a step further and I'll tell you what I think the questions you could really see. And it's okay to hate this because everybody does. This township I told you was how big?
6 by 6 miles.
6 miles by 6 miles. So if you were to take a look at this township and you were to blow it up and just look at this one township, within that township is actually 36 sections. This is what we're looking at right here. This is that township. And each one of these sections, it's getting weird real fast, I'm sorry. Sections. Each one of these sections is 1 mile by 1 mile. Because if this is 6 miles by 6 miles, you've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So each one is a 1 mile by 1 mile square. And there are 36 of them. And they go from the top right, number 1, to the top left, up to 6. Drop down, 7. Count back to 12. Drop down to 13. Anybody want to take a guess why it was numbered this way?
Because this is how horses would go. You'd go down one row and then back the other way.
There you go. Just like you would plow a field. Folks, think about when Thomas Jefferson was alive. Okay? They did not have satellite imagery and surveying systems to the technology that we do now. And so some poor fool had to go out there and actually walk these to, plat them out and do all these different things. And so it would not make sense to go 6 miles and you couldn't just teleport back. And so you did 6 miles and then you came back and then you went back. And then, so that's the way that this was done. And so it is the top right is number 1, the bottom right is number 36, and each one of these is 1 mile by 1 mile. Now, I'm going to introduce a question that I've seen on some testing materials just because I would worry that you'd be asked this. If I was to show you this grid, and I'm not, you wouldn't see it on the test, but if I was to ask you what section number is directly to the west of section 18. What number is it?
13.
It's 13. It is 13 of this township. Because every single one of these boxes is a township, and so they would abut to each other. So conversely, if I said, which section is directly to the south of 34? What would it be?
3.
3 of the township to the south. Everybody see how that works? Because every single township has this exact same grid pattern within it. And so every single one of these looks the exact same. So I've seen that question out there to, and I want you to know it just so it doesn't trip you up. Now, there's another number that comes into play that you do need to memorize for this as well. And that number is 640 acres. Every single section, these 1 mile by 1 mile squares, is 640 acres within it. Every single section. Well, how many square feet did I just say was in an acre?
43,560.
43,560. So I want to show you something cool. These are all 1 mile by 1 mile. Anybody know how long a mile is feet-wise?
5,280.
5,280. It sure is. So if I was dealing with 5,280 times 5,280, that gives me 27,878,400 square feet. If I was to divide that by 43,560, 640 acres. Every single section contains 640 acres. Sam says, is there a special reason for it being 6 by 6? Seems easier to do 5 by 5. I don't have the answer to that. I think the generalization is when they came up with this, I think they decided that, this 6 miles by 6 miles would be a relatively reasonable size for a town or a township, as they call them. So interesting little side note. If you've ever heard to a school referred to as Section 16, it's because that's where they used to put schools out there in these government survey systems, because it was presumably equal distance from everybody who lived in this township. They tried to keep it fair, so they put the schoolhouse in the middle. I don't know why it's 6s. So you need to know that 640. Now, just because they could ask that question, there's no math involved anymore. But let me show you the last little piece of this, and this is why you really, really, really would hate this if you had to do the math, but at least the math is gone, but you're still going to hate it, okay? If you look at this section right here that it's showing you, section 24, what they did is they now blew that 1 mile by 1 mile section up. And so within this section, same kind of thing happens. You have to think of it as a grid, just like before. You've got north, south, east, and west. And so if you were looking at this quarter of this section, this would be the northeast 1/4, or the northeast 1/4. If you were looking down here at this quarter, this is the southwest 1/4, or southwest 1/4. If you're looking down here, this would be the southeast. Everybody see how that works because of where you're falling in these north, south, east, and west quadrants? Here's what makes these so sucky, for lack of a better word. Every single box gets that same grid done to it. And so let me show you what I mean. If you were looking at this very specific shaded piece right here, the legal description for that piece of property is, you ready for this? The northeast 1/4 of the northwest 1/4 of section 24 of Township 3 North, Range 4 East. That is the legal description for that property.
Nope.
And let me explain why. If you look, it's always read as the smallest to the largest piece, because this is a small little piece within the section. And then we refer to the bigger piece, and bigger piece. So watch what happens. Within this grid right here, it is the northeast 1/4. And then this box right here is the northwest 1/4. And so that's what we're saying. It is the northeast 1/4 of the northwest 1/4 of the section 24, specifically of Township 3 North, Range 4 East on this principal meridian and baseline. And as I said, you can thank Thomas Jefferson or the Mormons if you want to believe that they did. I don't know. Thank somebody. I mean, it looks cool when you're flying. But here's the good news, folks. If you get your license in North Carolina and you never go and do real estate in another state, you will never have to worry about this in your entire life.
Praise Jesus.
Praise Jesus. Hallelujah and amen, right? Folks, it's not in North Carolina. We don't do this. It's that way. Depending on if I'm mirrored on your screen or not. Right? To the west. So, Missy, I'll just take that on. There's not going to be a lot of questions. Now, the reason we used to teach math on this, and so I really think I've covered here. Let me tell you the questions that I think you could see. What is it, right? You know, which type of legal description uses principal meridians, baselines, sections, and townships? The government rectangular survey system. I think you could see a question like that. Which section is directly to the left of section 19? I think you could see a question like that. And then here's the warning. The hardest question that I think you'll probably see at this point, if I just had to wager a guess, is 4 different ones of these and a picture like this. And you have to say, what is the legal description, the correct legal description of this property? And you just have to be able to identify that it is, you go smallest to largest, and you would have to be able to pick out that this is the northeast 1/4 of the northwest 1/4 of section 24. So you're going to have to just pick the best legal description. That's all you could possibly see. Go ahead.
Sorry. Are we given both the actual rectangular survey with the numbers on it and then the zoomed in version as well to let us know, I guess, the southern or the northern quadrant?
Yeah, you would, if they were asking you that, they would have to show you a picture just like this, because otherwise it wouldn't be fair.
Right. Okay. Of both of them.
Yeah, of both of them. They would have to give you some reference points so you know which township you were in, which section you were in, and which specific pieces of property they were talking about. Otherwise, they couldn't ask you which was the best legal description.
So, Seth, for example, where your little pencil's at on the east 1/2 of the southeast 1/4, if that was the shaded area, so your answer would be, I don't like this, and I like math.
Yeah,
Okay.
nobody likes this. So the answer, if you were shaded right here, this would be the east 1/2 of the southeast 1/4 of Township 24,
24.
range. Yep, range
Okay.
4 East. Township 3 North,
Okay.
range 4 East. Yep. And folks, it gets way smaller than this. So you could actually be within here, and so you could be dealing with like the northeast 1/4 of the northeast 1/4 of the northwest 1/4 of the township. You could be dealing with the lower half here. So it could be the south 1/2 of the southwest 1/4 of the northeast 1/4 of the southwest 1/4. I mean, it can get very, very small. But
Hopefully they won't do something that
the only reason that ever came into play really was for the math. And they're telling us now that you're not going to be tested on math. And so what this meant was it's what we call the denominator rule, folks. What you have to do is calculate how many how many acres were in these parcels. And so let's say if I said like the, northwest 1/4 of the southwest 1/4 of the, northeast 1/4. Well, all you would have to do to calculate the acreage is, I told you, it has 640 acres in one section. So what you would do is you take your 640 acres and divide by every denominator. And it doesn't matter which way you go. So divided by 4, divided by 4, divided by 4 would tell you that that piece of property had 10 acres. And so we used to teach you math questions where it would say, Farmer Brown purchased the northwest 1/4 of the southwest 1/4 of the northeast 1/4 at $6,000 an acre. How much did he spend? But I'm not going to teach it to you because on the syllabus it says math is not tested on this anymore. So I'm going to take their word on that, and I'm not going to waste our time. but know what it is, and look back at the slides and just be able to understand these meridians and baselines, the townships, how many acres are in it, the way that it flows, things like that. That's really what you need to know. Which is really relieving for me to just teach you only this much. You know how much time I used to spend on this crap? What you got, Misty?
So did you ever find out how many questions nationally and on the state sections that we would have to pass? I printed out the real estate licensing in North Carolina, and on here it says the national section you have to answer 57 correctly, and the state section 29 correctly. But you said they had added questions to it.
Yeah, you shouldn't have printed that out because I got the folks. Here's the thing. I told you I had the meeting today, and so I spent 2 hours with the real estate commission today via Zoom. I've got the new version. It's just a draft. They're still tweaking it.
Okay.
Everything I said is true. Okay, it is 80 questions on the national, 60 questions on the state portion. But those numbers aren't accurate because what you're looking at in that relink book basically says that you have to make like a 72.5 and a 73.4. It's 75 across the board now. But it's supposed to be what's called like a weighted average, and they didn't really explain what that meant to us yet. So we have another meeting with like the actual testing provider in the very near future. So I at the end of class remind me, and I will go ahead and share. Understand that they're drafts. They're not finalized copies, but they're as close, there may be some tweaks and some nuances. I will share with you the draft version of the relink book and the draft version of the new syllabus. But don't worry, that's where I told Jacob on day one, print out the current syllabus if you wanted to, because we're not going to change the flow of teaching. The information hasn't changed. Nothing in your curriculum has changed. I promise I'm going to more than prepare y'all. The only big change is 60 questions on the state portion versus the 40 previously. Everything else, y'all are good. Nothing's crazy. But I'll share with you the draft versions of it today.
Thank you.
For sure. Thanks, Justin. I like I was like in all caps, right? Super panicky. Justin's like, oh, she's got kicked out. Let her in now. For the love of God.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Did you read Jacob's?
That he set stuff on fire?
Yeah.
I've come to expect trouble from Jacob. It didn't even phase me at this point, right?
Is he
Like
okay?
Okay, listen. I have
he
all
looks
of my
fine.
flashcards right here, and I have been writing flashcards down and stuff as we go. And I also don't like bright light. It gives me a headache. And so I do everything basically off candlelight. And so I have a lot of
Well,
candles.
candles smell lovely too, man. I get it.
I set one of my flashcards too close and it caught on fire. And I tried to put it out, but I didn't have any way to put it out. And so it just kept burning. And then the fire alarm went off. And then my girlfriend came in. She was like, what the hell is going on?
Yeah.
Because she was like, I'm not even cooking. So it was a whole thing. But
it was a whole
everything is
thing.
fine.
It was a whole thing. That's right. If it makes you feel better, Jacob, I did the exact same thing the other day, kind of, sort of. We had the power go out when those storms came through in my area, and it was out for like 8 hours. And so my wife was trying to read something, and so I lit a candle so she could read. And I had this bright idea to take this cardboard box and kind of like put it behind it so the light would reflect off of it more, so she'd have more light. But then I guess the heat made the cardboard get soft after about 20 minutes, and so it kind of like folded down over and just caught on fire. And I'm like, well, that's unfortunate. Thankfully, I was right there, and I just threw it in the sink. But yeah, I've been there, done that, man.
Well, thank you. That makes me feel significantly less silly because that's even worse than what I did.
It's exactly right, man. It happens to the best of us sometimes. So that's right. What you got, Sam? Nope, can't hear you. Just make sure, here's my recommendation, Sam, because you have headphones on, make sure that you have selected the proper input device. If you click the little drop down arrow or the up arrow next to your microphone, just make sure that you've selected the appropriate device for your microphone.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, oh yeah.
Cool. So the 640 acres, is that per the whole township or per a section?
One section. Yeah.
Gotcha.
So the township contains 640 acres times 36.
Okay.
That's a lot of land, isn't it? Yeah.
More than I have.
Well, yeah, me too. 640 acres times 36. That's a lot of acres. Yeah. Folks, that being said, go take a break. Come back at 7:25 and we'll keep rocking and rolling. Whoop, whoop. So, we're talking about legal descriptions, and I told you the reason the legal descriptions are important is because we have to be able to adequately confirm which property is being conveyed. So thus far we've talked about the meets and bounds legal description and the government survey system, also called the rectangular survey system. Now I'm going to backtrack the slides real quick because I wanted to show you the visual. I told you these are comprised of townships, and the townships contain 36 sections, and each section is 1 square mile, and that equates to 640 acres. Okay, that is testable information. It is based on principal meridians and baselines, and this is mainly used west of the Mississippi. We're not going to go too much more, crazy into this because hopefully it's not going to be something that really becomes the bane of your existence on the test. But do be aware of it, and you'll see some in the review that you do. So let's keep going with these legal descriptions discussions, okay? Let's talk about the next one, which is the lot and block method, also referred to as reference to a recorded plat. And so this is something that is commonly utilized in more urban areas, right? Like your subdivisions, your cities, your populations, like that. Not very common in the country where people own hundreds of acres or anything. But what happens is, let's say a developer wants to build a subdivision. They will buy a piece of property. And we're going to talk more about that process in later sections, but they'll buy a piece of property and they will subdivide it into separate lots. And so they will hire a surveyor to come out and survey those lots out, and they will draw up a map of these surveyed out lots. And so it is called a lot and block method or reference to a recorded plat. So what they basically do is they take this map that they drew and they would record it at the Register of Deeds. That place that I told you is the public record. And so then when you look at this map, there is going to be numbers. This lot, that lot, that lot, right? 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, whatever it may be. It will reference phases, setbacks, a lot of imagery to kind of tell you what the lot is comprised of. And so at that point, you would just say, conveying all of lot 2 as seen on this plat map as recorded in Book of Maps 700 on page 22 or whatever it was. And so that means that you could go and look exactly where we just named and see a picture of the lot that's being conveyed. Now, when I talked about the Register of Deeds before and now, and we will continue to talk about the Register of Deeds, I told you it is county specific. So if this was located in Wake County, it would need to be recorded in Wake County Registry of Deeds. If it was in Johnson County, so on and so forth. And there is only one Register of Deeds that is at the county courthouse. If you didn't know this, every county has the county courthouse. Raleigh's is where the Wake County courthouse is. Smithfield is where the Johnston County courthouse is. Yeah, I couldn't tell you about all the other counties, but those are the two I do most business in. So all it is a picture, okay? It's a map that's recorded. And now this is an oversimplification of what the maps actually look like. But it would say, you know, lot 4 of block B of rolling acre subdivision or something along those lines. And so you could see exactly what it looks like. Now on these, it would also say, you know, the size, any easements or setbacks and things of that nature. So there's no confusion that if you look on this map, we're conveying everything within lot 4 to you. Yeah, that's exactly right, Jacob. New construction, they're always platted out just like this. So in the initial slide when we were talking about the different methods, you kind of grouped this one in reference to a recorded deed together. They're similar concepts, but they're not the same. When we reference the legal document, these are typically in what I told you called the book of maps or a plat book, depending on the municipality. And so you would actually look at the page number and find a picture. If we use a reference to a recorded deed, I told you there's no such thing as just the deed. There are multiple deeds for any given piece of property. But one of the requirements of a deed is to have a valid legal description on it. And so that's why we can use deeds as a reference as well. Because if we reference a deed and say, okay, well, the property is referenced in this deed, and you go and you pull up that deed, you will see another form of legal description. And so it's kind of like a transitive property. Because you reference this, and this references the legal description in a different format, it's adequate. So it would say something like the property as mentioned in Deed Book 2032 or 2132, page 541 of Johnson County Registry. So when you look up the deed on that exact page, you will see a legal description contained within that deed. Now here's where I'm going to give you a multifaceted learning point, folks. I'm going to show you a picture of a deed. This is a real deed that I pulled. Because it's a real deed, I blocked out the names just because it's a bunch of random people. I just found this deed and I liked it. It is public record, so I'm not doing anything weird by showing it to you, but I figured I'd cross out their names for you. So here's a deed. Okay, this is a North Carolina general warranty deed. This is about probably 2 miles away from my house in Willow Springs, North Carolina. And so I've been telling you that these deeds contain the grantor, which is the giver, and the grantee, which is the receivee. But so let me start with what the current lesson is. The current lesson is using this as a means for legal description. Well, if you were to reference this deed, it says right here on the deed, see Exhibit A attached hereto and incorporated herein by reference. So the second page of this deed is Exhibit A. And so this is why we can use this, because it has a separate legal description to it. Now, folks, take a look at this and tell me what type of legal description this is on this deed.
The first one we went over, that's the meets and bounds.
There you go. The first one we went over will not be a test option. So yes, meets and bounds it is. And so this is where I told you, it is just a bunch of verbiage. So beginning at the stake in the center of SR 1531, a corner with lot number 1, runs thence along the line of lot number 1, north 46 degrees, 45 minutes west, 1,083 feet, to a stake in the line of lot number 3, thence along the line of lot number 3, north 43 degrees, 15 minutes east, 1,485 feet, so on and so forth. Now, it also does talk about a plat map in here as recorded in Book of Maps. Now, it didn't actually reference the page numbers in this deed that I gave you. But this is a meets and bounds legal description, and that's what I'm telling you. The biggest thing you'll have to understand is you're not going to have to write one of these on your test. But you're going to have to know that a meets and bounds legal description contains monuments, point of beginning, clockwise. The calls is the directions you go, right? It talks about degrees, talks about minutes. These are all verbiages that you would have to recognize for a meets and bounds legal description. What you got, Sam?
Are all monuments these days the metal stakes in the grounds, or do they use other examples these days?
Nowadays, when one of these is being written out, they would use the metal stakes in the ground always. But there are still some that exist that have not been redone for over 100 years, and you would still see references to some of the more antiquated monuments, probably on some older ones. Yeah. Just has to be something semi-permanent in nature. So I'm going to backtrack here, and I'm going to show you something else, which makes this a multifaceted learning point. This is why I like this deed so much. I want you to realize that this is actually a deed that contains both tenants in common, 1/2 undivided interest and 1/2 undivided interest as tenants in common, which means they could potentially do what with their shares, their 1/2 share? What could they do with it eventually?
Will it?
Will it, because it's tenant in common. But more than that, this is also a conventional life estate. It's probably not the way that you thought a conventional life estate would look, but look right here. They named grantor grantee, but it says subject to the life estate of the grantors, which is reserved herein. So they basically created something that would bypass probate. They still are the legal owners of it so long as they are alive. But once they die, these people are named as remainder men. So this is a conventional life estate where these people will take ownership as remainder man once this conventional life estate is up as equal tenants in common. See how that works? That's why I like this deed so much. I marked out all the people, but it's very fascinating because it's a great example for some of the concepts we've talked about already. So when we're talking about the deed, I've already told you this, okay? The deed is just this document that shows where this concept of title was transferred. Okay, it is not the ownership itself. Title is a concept. A deed is a document showing this transfer of title, that there was a sale or an exchange or a transfer in some way, shape, or form. And so we're about to get into deeds a little bit more, so I'm just going to leave it at that for a second. And the last note on these legal descriptions is, as I said, just saying something like 123 Main Street or West Hill Street or whatever it may be, that's called an informal reference. It's typically not satisfactory for a sales contract, and it's not satisfactory for identifying a piece of property on a deed. We may use it, but we would accompany it with some other type of more powerful legal description. So let me just make sure y'all are comfortable with one other term I threw out there, and that is a survey. Folks, a survey is where a surveyor, okay, a licensed person who has this skill can come out and they can find all your property boundaries. If you ever have a survey done, they will typically come out and they'll put little flags or stakes in the ground to show you where your different points are, because those iron rods, as I said, are typically buried in the ground or barely hanging out. And so a surveyor can come out and show your property lines. You should get a survey to discover things like encroachments, like easements, like whether you have access to a public right-of-way, and things of that nature. So, as I said, these legal descriptions would have to be adequate so a surveyor could go out and find them all. Now, more importantly than that, and this is going to make more sense in a moment, when we're dealing with a property survey, understand that they are not required in a real estate transaction. They are a good idea, but they are not required. And so one point of emphasis here is if a buyer elects to not have a survey, and if they had had a survey, it would have discovered a title defect, like an encroachment that was so bad title is unmarketable, and they elected not to have one, and it's discovered later, when they try to file a claim with their title insurance policy, they will say, no, we're not covering that because you did not elect to have a survey. So that's just kind of an interesting note. If I had to guess, that's going to be more of a, well, it's probably a national thing, but that's definitely how it works in North Carolina. So let me just throw in, before we kind of switch gears and talk about deeds a little bit more in depth, I referenced the acreage and some of the math that goes with it. Remind me once again, how many square feet are in 1 acre?
43,560.
43,560. There you go. 4 gold, old, whatever you want to call them, ladies, driving 35 and a 60. So the reason that that's important, I told you, is because you will be doing calculations with both plots of land and homes. That is part of the math that you have to know, is area calculations, and they can get a little more in depth. So I'm going to give you a quick little introduction into different types of math you could see in this regard. Right now we are looking at a rectangular piece of property. Yet again, it is just 150 feet by 50 feet. Now I told you that the calculations for area of a rectangle is just length times width. Now folks, please do not get so caught up on the words length and width. It's just one side times one side. You could say length and depth, as it is in this case. You could say width and depth. It doesn't matter what you call it, as long as you understand that it is one side multiplied by one side. So in this particular example, if I said find the area of this, it is 150 feet times 50 feet. And remember, you can't just call it 7,500 feet. It is square feet, okay? Square feet. Now, you know this magic number, 43,560. So if I said convert this to acres, you have to see how many times does 43,560 go into this. So divide by 43,560. It's only 0.17 acres. Now, the other things that you could see tested is linear running feet. So in this instance, the perimeter, you've got 150 feet. Ooh, that's a janky line. Oh my God, I'm having a stroke. 150 feet. 50 feet. Another 150 feet. And 50 feet. So if we ask for the linear running feet, or in other words, the perimeter, you just add it all together. That's what we did here for 400 feet. There is another important reference for this on front feet. Now in this picture, it has 150 feet of front footage. In this instance, that front footage is along a road, but this is actually a very popular concept in real estate in the real world. You pay more for more beach frontage, more lake frontage, more road frontage, more whatever. So sometimes properties are not priced just by how big they are. Sometimes they're priced based on how many front feet they have. Businesses like to be right on highways. Of course, we all like to be more on the beach and have more beach property, right? Or whatever it may be. So sometimes it may say something like, well, you know, this property sold for, you know, $80,000, and how much was that if it was charged based on the front footage? Well, so you would have to divide by your front feet of 150 to figure out that it sold for $533 per front foot. So a lot of different concepts you could potentially see. Now I will tell you, most of the time with things like front footage, they will use the term front feet, or they'll give some context clues. If I was to say a rectangle that is 150 feet with a depth of 50 feet, that depth tells you how far back you're going. So that word depth tells you that this other number is our front footage. But if we don't give you any context clues, if we don't use verbiage, the first number is always the front footage. So if I said a property that's 150 feet by 50 feet, that first, if we're referencing front footage, that first number is going to be your front footage. So a couple different things that you could be asked to do mathematically speaking. Now I will explain this to you. Folks, when we're dealing with properties, of course we converted this to acres. When we get into it in a little bit, in the agency section, we're going to talk about the residential square footage guidelines about measuring houses. It's the same methodology. Just instead of this being green and you picturing it as a lot, just picture it as a house. If this was a ranch style house, the math is the same. If you're calculating area of a house, it's just houses we talk about in square footage, properties we talk about in acreage. Does that make sense for everybody? The math concept is the same. So if you look to, and here in a little bit, I'll jump into some of these. I want to get into some of the other concepts, but if you look, the next section is, in this math, dealing with, or not the next, right here, measurements, square footage, calculations, acreage, conversions, all these different things. which is a good way to practice it. Now, I do want to point out one thing because it is going to come up here, and we'll practice it in a minute, but let me just make it so much easier. Folks, do any of you know the area calculation for a triangle?
1/2 base times height.
1/2 base times height. It sure is. So if we said that you were trying to calculate a area of a triangle, it is 1/2 base times height. So in other words, if you were looking at a triangle, and I said this was 4 and this was 5, what this is saying is you would take your base, 4, multiply it by your height, 5, and then divide it by 2. It's just dividing it by 2 because 1/2 is the same as saying 0.5. So, I mean, same thing, right? 0.5 times 5 times 4, 20 times 0.5. You see what I'm saying? It's the same thing. Cut it in half. That's all it is for area of a triangle. Now, let me tell you why, folks. Don't let this freak you out. If you look at this rectangle, remind me, what is the formula for calculating area of a rectangle?
Length times width.
Length times width. Now, if I was to take a line and draw it from here to here, what did I just create?
Triangle.
2 triangles.
2 equal triangles. So it's really just saying length times width, or whatever you want to call it, base times height, whatever you want to call it, and then dividing it by 2. That's why it works. Don't let triangles confuse you. It's just base times height and then divided by 2. Because if you just did base times height, you're finding all of this. So dividing it by 2 gives you just the triangle. Does that make sense for everybody? So one thing that you could see is something like a house measurement, and the house having a bay window. Well, folks, what is this geometric shape called?
Trapezoid.
Trapezoid. You'd be surprised how often I teach these classes and ain't nobody in the room know what that's called. And I'm being dead serious. Parallelogram. Geometric shape. Half of a stop sign, right? It's not technically half of a stop sign. It's just the top portion. So it's a trapezoid. Now, folks, there is a calculation for area of a trapezoid. But listen to me. Stephanie probably knows it. But listen to me, folks. Don't nobody but Stephanie need that kind of negativity in their life. Okay? Let me show you what a trapezoid is. It's 2 triangles and a rectangle. So that means if, let's say, this was 6, that means this is 6. If this was 2, this was 2, and this is 4, you have a 6 by 4 rectangle and a 4 by 2 triangle. Don't overcomplicate things. So if I said find me the area of this bay window, it would be 6 times 4 for 24 square feet right here. And then each triangle would be 4 times 2 divided by 2, which means each triangle is 4 square feet. Don't overcomplicate it. Then you just add it all up. 24, 28, 32. 32 square feet. But I see what I did there? Stephanie, I swear to God, if you use the calculation for area of a trapezoid just now, I'm gonna flip this desk. I'm gonna flip it. Nobody need that.
Do you want to know what it is?
It's like 1/2 top, bottom, something, something or another, plus divided by 2. Like
A plus B divided by 2 times the height.
There you go. And ain't nobody need that. No, shh. That's enough. That's enough, okay? None of these folks need. Listen.
Would you make it harder than it is?
Yeah, but she already knows it, so it's not harder for her. But I'm trying to save y'all. Yeah. It's not harder for her because she already knows it. I'm trying to save y'all. Folks, I've been teaching this for a long time. I know y'all don't need this kind of negativity in your life, so I'm trying to help y'all, okay? Stephanie, you do you, boo-boo. Okay, you can use the trapezoid formula. Ain't none of these folks going to use this trapezoid formula, right? They're not.
That's why I asked you, as long as you get the right answer, it doesn't matter how you
That's exactly right. It doesn't matter how you get it. And that's why you have my full permission. Folks, if you start talking about cats in your mathematical equation and somehow get the right answer, I could care less. Okay? You do you. So, let me just make sure you understand what I'm saying. And in a moment, I'll give you a couple practice questions. I'll pull that math packet out and I'll give you an opportunity to work through a couple and I'll show you just to make sure you are comfortable on this. But as I said, we're not going to spend an ungodly amount of time on the math for good reason. We got a lot of other stuff that is way more testable. But let me just make sure you're with me here. When calculating the area of a rectangle, you would multiply the blank of the lot by the blank of the lot. What goes in those blanks?
length and width.
Bam. How about this? Basic units are townships that are blank miles square containing blank number of sections. What goes in those blanks?
6 miles? So you're 6 miles?
Yep, townships are 6 miles square containing how many sections?
36.
36 sections. There you go. How about this? Each section is how many square miles?
6. No, I'm sorry. It is
460.
640, right?
Square miles.
One.
Oh, yeah.
1 square mile. Each section is 1 square mile. Remember, a mile is 5,280 feet. Okay? But each one of those square miles contains now how many acres?
640.
640. Jacob, you might be dyslexic. I'm just picking on you.
It's a possibility.
It's a possibility. Listen, I'm just picking on you. All right, and then the last big number that you got to memorize, okay? There are blank square feet in an acre. How many?
43,560.
There you go, folks. 43,560. How we feeling? Not too terrible, right? But nobody's freaking out yet. Except maybe about the government survey system, huh, Misty? Just that one? We'll just take the L on that one. That's okay. Yeah, just don't.
Just gotta memorize those numbers.
Yeah.
Me and numbers don't like each other.
Yeah, and honestly, folks, you know, I mean, I can give you these fun little mnemonics, and I can ask you and quiz you, but it's just something that's got to stick with you. Now, the running joke is that's like the only thing, because we beat it into your head so much, that's like the only thing you will remember for like the first couple of years after you get your license. For whatever reason, everybody remembers 43,560, but I can attest to the fact that it does go away, because I was a broker for 4 years before I started teaching. And when I started teaching, I was like, oh crap, I forgot about that. I never used it. Ever. I used it once in my career very early on, but I never used it until I was a teacher. So, really and truthfully. So, just a couple recap vocabulary pieces as we move into transferring title. Metes and bounds is a type of legal description used in the original 13 colonies. Monuments, minutes, degrees, calls, bounds, point of beginning. All of this is verbiage for metes and bounds. Point of beginning is part of it. Township is the large pieces that are the 6 square miles within the government survey system. Sections are the smaller pieces. There are 36 of those. Reference to a recorded plat is another legal description. Reference to a recorded deed as well. Let me give you just a couple math questions just to make sure we're comfortable, and then we're going to talk about transferring title. Start with this one, number 1. Do it for me real quick. Tell me what you got. You're throwing the answer in the chat already. All we are looking for is the area of a lot with a width of 250, length of 190. So 250 times 190 gives us 47,500 square feet. Number 2. So this one is just wanting the area of this triangle, base of 50. I'm going to move this over here. Base of 50 times your height of 90 divided by 2. Area is 2,250 square feet. Let's take it up a little bit. Do 4 for me.
Misty, that was fast. I just finished writing down the problem on my paper.
Yeah, you gotta be careful with what it's asking. We're doing 4, but here's the deal with it. How many acres in a triangular lot with a base of 250 and a height of 300? This is a multi-step math problem. So you got your base of 250 times your height of 300 divided by 2, which gives you your square footage, but we want your acres. There are 43,560 acres square feet in 1 acre. So you need to divide by that magic number, 43,560, to figure out how many acres this is. It is 0.86 acres. So you got to be careful because you can't compare apples to oranges. They may be looking for acreage. They may be looking for square footage. You may have to go one way. You may have to go back the other way. I'll give you 2 more. Let's see if I can find a slightly more difficult one. See how we're doing. Let's do 6. So, multi-step math problem yet again. What is the cost of a lot that is 200 feet by 400 feet at $25,000 per acre? So you've got 200 feet times 400 feet, which gives us our square footage, but that's not the unit of measure we're dealing with. We know the price per acre, so we need to convert it to acres. Divided by 43,560. This piece of property is 1.83 acres or 1.84 depending on how you rounded. I told you the question will never come down to rounding, and so then you need to multiply that by your cost per acre, 25,000. So it would cost $45,913. 14 if you round. Anybody okay with that?
I'm not. Did not get that at all. And I did this. Maybe I am dyslexic. Because I just did that. 200 times 400.
Yep.
Right, for the square foot.
200 times 400, which gives us...
And I got the acreage, which was 1.84.
Yep, divided by 43,560, which is 1.84.
Okay, and then...
multiply it by $25,000 an acre.
No, it's $25,000 an acre.
That's what I just said.
You said 20,000.
25,000.
He said 25.
Right there on the calculator. 25000. Is your calculator playing tricks on you? Yeah, it's always fine to round, Tim. I told you, it will never come down to rounding. Rounding is fine. Because we'll tell you on the test.
No, yeah, I just plugged that exact same thing in. When I put in, watch this, I swear, I'm not geeking out here. 1.84 times 25,000. It pulls up with 46.
That's because you have your calculator set to round to the nearest thousand for whatever reason. It's a setting in your iPhone. So it's for whatever reason your iPhone is rounding up, and that's what's causing you to like freak out. Because I mean, even if I just did, you know, the rounded, right, 1.83 times 25,000. 45,750. Your iPhone is just rounding to the nearest thousand.
No, because he did it 1.84 acres times 25,000. Which
Oh, he just did 1.84?
Yep.
There you go. It's just because you rounded too high.
Well, but that was the 1.84 is the rounding.
Well, and like I said, if you were to actually look at this worksheet is based on 3 decimals. So whenever you get 200 times 400 divided by 43,560, you should actually leave this whole worksheet is based off of 3 decimals. I didn't do it, but I'm telling you it'll never come down to rounding. But so this should be 1.837. Is actually what this whole worksheet is based off of, 3 decimals. So then 1.837 times 25,000, 45,925.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, got it. So round up to the 3rd decimal point.
For this entire worksheet, yeah, if you look back at like the very beginning of it, it'll actually say that. Set calculator decimal places to 3 places.
Okay.
Yeah.
But on our test, it'll tell us.
On your test, it would tell you to the nearest whole number, the nearest cent, the nearest, except for one concept that I'm about to teach you in a second. It will never tell you because there's a rule that you have to know. So yeah, don't let the rounding get you so much. I mean, that was a big difference based on that rounding, but yet again, it will never come down to rounding on the test. So nobody panic. Let me give you one more to make sure you're good on this concept. And folks, they do get way harder. So let me try to find one that's just slightly harder.
So what math is not on the exam? You said that there wasn't math on the
The government rectangular survey system no longer has math on the exam in North Carolina. But everything I'm teaching you otherwise does have, you know, it's on the exam.
Okay.
I'm not going to get into the cubic today. This one right here should be a good practice one. Work through that one, and then we'll move on into some other concepts for a moment. I'm going to show it on the calculator. Now, folks, let me make a couple statements before we work through this together, okay? Number one, everybody just has to realize right now that there are some people who are just better at math than others, and it is what it is. But here's the tough love piece, folks. If you are not good at math, you better practice it out the yin yang, the wazoo, the whatever you want to call it, the tuchus. And here's why. Not so much because it's going to be your make or break on your test. Can you pass and get a license with getting every math question wrong? Sure you can. But folks, you're endeavoring into a career that is based around math. How much are we offering on this house? What's the counter offer? What's the down payment? What's the percentage? What's the amortization? What's the loan amount? How much you have to pay in taxes? There is math in this industry. Because listen, I want you to listen, make eye contact, get weird for a second, folks. Look at me. I bet you'll all learn math when it comes down time to calculating a commission check, won't you? You gonna make sure that that's right. So you better learn the math for your clients as well. So it takes practice, folks. Some of you are just naturally math people. Some of you are not. And that's okay. But you got to practice it to get better at it, okay? So there's a little bit of tough love piece. Now let me explain this for you. Do not be so proud that you won't write this down. You will have scrap paper on the test. So folks, draw a picture. A triangular lot, here's a road, has a road frontage of 500 feet and a depth of 620 feet. The owner agrees to sell the lot for $8,000 per acre. How much money per front foot will the owner receive if he sells the lot successfully? Okay, well, this is a multifaceted math problem. So let me put my calculator over here. I'm going to erase that red circle. So first, find the area. 500, which is your base, times your height of 620, divided by 2. There is your square footage of this lot. So it is 155,000 square feet, divided by your 43,560 to get the acreage. So yet again, I'm going to round it for the way that this is intended to be, okay? So I'm going to round this to 3.558 acres. And so he wants to sell the lot for $8,000 per acre. So take your 3.558 acres times your $8,000 per acre, which means we're selling it for $28,464. But the question is, how much did he sell it for per front foot? So take your sold price and divide it by your front feet. 56.93. Because there are 500 front feet. So you got the price based on the acreage, but we wanted to know how much that equated to per front foot. Does that make sense? Yeah. What were you saying, Corey?
I don't understand why we divide it by 500 feet.
Because it's asking for your road frontage.
Yeah, you've always got to answer what the question actually is, right? That's the most important thing. The question is, how much money per front foot will the owner receive? So we want to know...
I mean in the equation.
Because there's 500 front feet. So we found the actual sold price because it was sold based on a price per acre. But what we're ultimately asking was, well, what does that equate to as a cost per front foot? So you took your sold price and you divided it by your 500 front feet to say, okay, well, if it was based on front footage, we got 56.93 per front foot.
So I don't understand, and here's why, right? Because if it's I thought that the other information was kind of a mislead because we already know how many front feet there is.
Yep.
So we just need to know how many acres that front feet is. So I was doing the 500 divided by 345.60.
Where did you get 345.60?
Or not 300. I'm sorry. The
43,560?
40. Yes.
Yeah. Hold on. You got to understand, 500 is a linear measurement. That is feet, not square feet. Front feet is a line, and so it is a 500-foot line. So that is just one corner of a lot. And so you can't compare apples to oranges. We know that he's selling it for $8,000 per acre. Your first step is to find how many acres this is so you can know what he actually sold it for. But then the actual question is, well, okay, once you find out what he sold it for, what does that equate to as a cost per front foot? So you took the sold price and divided it by front footage to figure out the price per front foot. Because that is an actual equation in real estate. Sometimes things are sold per front foot. And so we just want to know what the value of this property was per front foot based on the price that he got for it.
Hey, Seth, that makes sense right now.
Make sense?
Yeah, because I followed the directions and I misread the problem and I didn't go back and do that last part where I asked about the 500 front feet though, but I was figuring out every other step though, so I had to go back and read it twice to understand it.
There you go. And you got to be exceptionally careful, right? Because you've got to always understand what the actual question is. Folks, let me give you, this is a recommendation not for just math questions, but all questions. You have to read the question in its entirety, establish what it's actually asking you, reread the question again, and then try to tackle it. That is the best test taking suggestion I can give you. If you don't know what it's actually asking you, you will never get it right. And the other thing is, folks, let me tell you another thing, okay? You got to train your brains right, because I told you this is 60% material, 40% test taking. I'm going to ask you a question, and I want all of you to go to the chat, and I want you to tell me the answer to this question, okay? You ready for this? What is 2 plus 2? Very happy. A math question. You're right. But, folks, the answer is 4. Now, let me explain why I just did that to you. If I asked you 2 plus 2, and you're looking at a test, you're going to find the answer that says 4, and you're going to, oh, it's that one. Don't you ever do that on a real estate test. Don't ever look for what the right answer is after you read the question. You'll get it wrong. You have to analyze every single answer choice, and you have to find the most correct answer, because sometimes there are answers that seem as a generalization correct, but it's not the best answer. It's not the most correct answer.
Seth,
Yeah.
I taught math. I actually taught algebra for 6 years. So what I would suggest for anybody that struggles with math is you're going to have scrap paper. So just write down exactly what you know. So, you know, you can put 500 feet road frontage. That's also your length. Then your depth or your width is 620. And then how much you have per acre. And then you already know that your 43,560 is how many square feet are in an acre. So if you just jot down everything and then look at the last question, or there may be multiple questions, how much money per front foot. So then you have all your information. So what do you need to be able to get to that specific question's answer? And that'll help you with not skipping steps if you write everything. And there's 7 or 8 math questions, and you're going to have scrap paper, so it shouldn't take a lot of room to write it down. And it's just an easy way. I mean, I taught 8th, 9th, and 10th graders, and I mean, I promise it works if you'll just take the steps and do it.
It does. It absolutely does. And
there is no shame in that. You're right, Monica. It works very well.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Very well said. Go
Sorry,
ahead.
I had a comment on this one. I noticed a lot of people answered A, and I was trying to figure out how everybody got to that answer, because the price of that lot was $28,466, not $28,480.
Once again, if you didn't round right.
Okay.
Yeah, if you wouldn't have rounded.
I was like, if it's not exact, it's probably a good idea that it's not the right answer.
Yeah.
$14.
And you got to be careful, because there are some times where you're right, it's not exact, but you know, because of rounding and some other things like that, it could trip you off. So I think you're right. You know, it's probably a good bet. There's a gnat in here. I'm like not practicing karate or anything. I'm just like, yeah. Folks, don't sweat about it, but let me give you an example of what I mean, because I know I kind of freaked you out, but it is very much a big thing about test taking. Now, I've heard when they've revamped the exam, we all kind of had this inclination to think that the exam was cruel and unusual, that it was worded in such a way that it was very tricky and very mean and hateful. Well, they actually invited us as educators to the real estate commission halls and we actually got to participate in exam writing seminars where we were writing questions for them, and they can't confirm nor deny whether or not they used any of our exam questions that we wrote as educators. But the whole idea was they're not trying to trick you with double negatives and crap like that anymore, but there is subjectively more than one correct answer. And I'll give you an example of what I mean. Folks, we're going to get into agency in a little bit, and when we talk about agency, there is something called an agency disclosure. And in North Carolina, every state has disclosure laws, but in North Carolina, the deadline for giving an agency disclosure to somebody is what we call first substantial contact. Well, folks, you have to understand that we're testing you on rules and regulations, not best practices. So you may have a test option that says, give somebody a disclosure as soon as you meet them. Yeah, that's great in the real world, but that's not answering the question. The question is going to be something like, what is the deadline? Not when is the best time. So you've got to be very careful, because in your mind you may say, well, give it to them as soon as you meet them, then you're just done. Yeah, but that's not what they asked. They asked, what's the deadline? Do you see the difference there? You got to be very careful between best practice and deadline, because we're not teaching you best practices in this class. That comes later. We're teaching you laws, rules, regulations, ways to interpret things literally. Everybody with me? Go ahead.
So best practices, basically, from what I've been told, you learn more so in post-licensing versus, because now we're just learning rules and regulations. And then once you're establishing that, then you learn the more nitty-gritty of it.
When you come to my post-licensing classes, I will teach you how to take advantage of the other parties. I will teach you how to get the best deal for your clients. I will teach you some really strong negotiating tactics. I will teach you what you need to know about contracts to prevent your clients from ever getting sued. I will teach you all of that. You're not there yet. That's not what this class is about. I would wager that about 40% of this stuff from this class you will get rehashed out in a more in-depth way. The other 60% goes the way of the dodo. You don't need it. It's just to make sure you understand. I'm not going to say you don't need it, but it's not in your regular day-to-day interactions. Like, for instance, when I start talking about financing and pity payments, we have loan officers who do that stuff. But you need to have a basic understanding so you can explain it to your clients so they know if they can even afford a house. Is it even realistic? And what is an escrow payment? And what is, your monthly payment equate to? What does amortization mean? So you do use it, just not to the extent that it sounds like you're going to use it in this class. That make sense? There is another layer to this, and that is when we get into things like cubic feet, folks. Square feet is length times width. Cubic feet, if you remember the old school way to draw a cube. Okay. Then you're like, I can't erase that little piece in the middle, but you get what I'm saying. It's a cube. And so buildings are three-dimensional. And so sometimes we look at things like cubic feet or cubic feet of, a driveway, which is length times width times height. And the confusing thing about that is, if this was a yard, for example, 1 yard times 1 yard times 1 yard, that'd be 1 cubic yard. But there are 3 feet in a yard, and so that is the equivalent of 27 cubic feet. 3 feet times 3 feet times 3 feet. So 1 cubic yard is the equivalent of 27 cubic feet. And some of these conversions get weird. Now let me show you something, folks. When I'm giving you these assignments that you have and this math packet that you have, I'm still working on some of them, but if you look right here, we have links to videos, and it's some yuts that looks exactly like me explaining how to work out all of these different things. So there is one of me talking about cubic yards and how to work out the problems on this. So when you go and you practice them and you don't know what's going on, you can come here and you can click it and you can see the workout of all these different problems. So there's a resource to help you understand these, to help practice it. And the answer key does exist for that math packet as well. So just keep that in mind. So you can always check your work. But practice. Math is all about practice. Nobody's panicking. Everybody's okay. Not a bit. Listen, nobody start looking at that window. All right, like I'm gonna jump. I'm gonna do it. Especially if you're on the first floor. That's just silly. Mild panic, folks. I told you on day one, this is probably the hardest thing that any of you have ever done, and that was not an understatement. We've barely scratched the surface, but the more we dive deeper and deeper into it, the more we kind of tie concepts to other concepts, you'll start feeling better. I promise. You will feel like a completely different person towards the end of this class versus where you are right now. I mean, think about it. We are just now hitting 24 hours. We're not even a third of the way into this class. So, lots more to come. Go take a break. Come back at 8:40. Whoop, whoop. Misty said, can we move on from math? It sent me to chocolate. Listen, at least you have an excuse for chocolate. Lord knows I don't need one, okay? Chocolate and me are always the best of friends. But I will warn you, Misty, be careful what you wish for. Because while you may not like the math, I promise there are non-math concepts that are even worse than the math.
I'm actually fairly strong in agency and the deed stuff. So the first time around, I leaned heavily on those types of things because I was not strong in math.
There you go. Agency is a good one. Very testable. So, I will let us move on from math for a moment, but there is another math concept, although a much easier one that I will introduce soon. In the home stretch tonight, let's talk about deeds and deed transferences and things of that nature, okay? So I'm going to remind you about deeds, okay? Deed is a document that shows that the transfer of title has happened. And so I'll give you the comparison that I gave you earlier in this class. When you own a car, you have a car title. It is a physical document that states that you own the car. When we talk about title in real estate, it is a concept, this concept of ownership. And so when title transfers from one person to another, a deed is evidencing that transfer. But here's an interesting statement, folks. If you own a house right now, there is probably a deed that names you as the grantee. So here's the interesting piece. That deed does not guarantee that you own the property. It is this weirdest thing that you have to understand. That deed suggests that you are most likely the owner of the property. That there is probably nobody else that could claim superior title or superior ownership to that property. It is just the weirdest thing. Like, don't anybody like panic after and be like, oh my God, what do you mean I don't actually own my house? Yeah, you do, but it's not finite, right? Like there are weird ownership properties where, there's some ambiguities. There are times where things are done incorrectly. There are times where there's confusion. So just understand that a deed existing with your name on it doesn't guarantee ownership. It just shows that you are the owner of record and you are presumably the owner and nobody else could claim superior ownership, that title, okay? That's what a deed is. And so these deeds, they get a little confusing because they all typically exist in what I refer to as the public record, the Register of Deeds office. And so you record them there to let the public know that that title transfer happened and to let the public know that you are the most recent grantee of the property. So the deed is just the document that represents it. Title is a concept. Okay, there is no such thing as a title. It is a concept of title, to hold title, to have title, but it's not a document. So There's no physical document called a title, but there is these deeds, and these deeds show the date where it was transferred from person A to person B, presumably. And there's a couple different ways that this can happen. Now, I do want to point out something before we get a little more in depth, okay? When we start talking about these deeds and title transfers, they are a legal type of document. But here's a word of caution. Yet again, just like 90% of all other things in this class, it's going to end up sounding like another concept. And you've got to keep them separate in your minds. Deeds and contracts have very similar verbiages. They are both legal documents. They both fall under certain legal doctrines, if you will. But you've got to always read the question carefully and make sure what the question is asking, because answering a question on a deed is very different than answering a question on a contract. Because a deed is the document that shows where ownership was transferred. A contract is a document that's leading up to a sale, which is where the ownership would transfer. So a contract is typically a precursor to a deed. Very often in a real estate transaction, they're both occurring, but they are very different things, if you will. So let me introduce a word that's important in this class for multiple reasons, and that word is alienation. You probably heard the term something like alienation of affection or something from a legal point of view, which is, basically going after somebody if they, cause the end of your marriage or something like that. But alienation is just a fancy word to remove yourself from. That's it. That's all alienation means. So in the real estate context, when we say alienation, what we mean is removing yourself from your ownership. That's all alienation is. And so just like when we mentioned encumbrances earlier and we said liens could be voluntary or involuntary, alienation can also be voluntary or involuntary. There are times when you choose to remove yourself from the ownership, and there are other times where the ownership is taken from you without your choice. Very much the truth. So when we say voluntary, you could sell it, you could gift it, you could give it, you could, exchange something. You could, a lot of different ways that you could voluntarily remove yourself from ownership. Involuntary alienation typically involves not so fun things. Foreclosures, eminent domain, adverse possession, operation of law. So your ownership was removed from you by force. That is an involuntary alienation. Now, folks, I want to provide a brief little piece of clarity because, yet again, here's what I hate about this concept and the way that I have to teach it to you. If you go out and you Google any real estate concept, you can get differentiating answers. You really can. That's just the honest to God truth, and it drives me nuts. And so I try to, point that out to you, and you just got to be careful on the test. So let me tell you why I'm telling you this. Some resources argue it one way, some resources argue it the other way. I would argue that it just stands on its own little island. What I'm talking about is leaving something to somebody in a will. Arguably, folks, it's semi-voluntary because you pick who the property is going to. But what you don't pick is when you die, unless you do it deliberately. So a will or transferring to somebody, after death, that is not necessarily voluntary or involuntary. You'll see some testing providers try to say that it's involuntary. Some try to say it's voluntary. I argue that it stands on its own little island, but just read the question carefully because you can still always answer it to the best of your ability. So when somebody dies and they leave a will to give somebody property, okay, that is called dying testate. Okay, that's the verbiage for it. When you die and you do have a will, it's called dying testate. If you die and you do not have a will, it is called dying intestate. And so if you die without a will, that's where I told you that the law of intestate succession will come into play. And so every state, their law of intestate succession is slightly different. In North Carolina, we have the law of intestate succession where North Carolina basically writes a will for you. And I told you it's not testable in any way, shape, and form. But if you die without a will, your stuff would go to your kids. If you don't have kids, it'd go to your parents. If you don't have parents, it would go to your siblings. If you don't have siblings, it goes to your, I'm trying to think who's after that. Your first cousins. Or no, I'm sorry, spouses first in North Carolina. Spouse, then kids, then parents, then siblings, then first cousins. And I think that might be where it dies. But that's too in-depth for this class. You don't need to know the exact way that it goes and who would end up with it. But what I told you, though, is if you die without a will and the law of intestate succession kicks in and there's nobody to give it to in that list, that's when this certain thing comes into play that I mentioned. It was called escheat, which is where the government takes your property. Now, we're going to talk more about that one in a second. But dying with a will is called testate. Dying without a will is called intestate. Just another piece of vocabulary. Remember when we looked at the or and e words? There was the devisor and the devisee. A devise is when somebody leaves you real property by way of a will. So the person who left you the real property in the will is the devisor. The person who gained real property by way of a will is called the devisee. If you get left personal property, it's called a bequest. So let's talk for a second about some of these involuntary alienations. And I want to group this in your mind so you keep it separate on the test. Remember when we talked in encumbrances and we talked about an easement by prescription. And we very specifically said on there, this is not adverse possession. Well, here let's talk about adverse possession. Adverse possession is a type of involuntary alienation. It is a very unique law that exists in some states where you can steal somebody else's property. So you see on this screen, it's the exact same criteria as the easement by prescription. It's just that in easement by prescription, you are basically stating that you should get to continue to use the property. In adverse possession, you are claiming you should now own the property. There is a huge differentiation there, right? Very different. So the criteria is the exact same. OCEAN is the acronym. Open, continuous, exclusive, adverse, and notorious. Now, some testing providers or some resources that you will look at maybe will use the term high OCEAN. High, HI added to it is just hostile and what can I think of what the I is? It's basically the same thing. Notorious and hostile. It's redundant to say high OCEAN, in my opinion, because you got everything you need right there. Open means it's not hidden. Continuous means you haven't stopped doing it for this period of time. Exclusive means you're the only one doing it. Adverse means adverse to the ownership. You know it's not yours. And notorious means you're doing it without permission. So let me just give you a really weird example of this. Now, folks, everybody is always so interested in adverse possession, where somebody steals the land of another. Of course you're interested in it. It sounds like a very interesting concept. But we're not going to go down a rabbit hole. You're not going to ask me 10 million questions about it, and understand that it is exceptionally hard to actually ever acquire somebody's property by way of adverse possession. But let me just give you a real-world example of this. Let's say that you were really close friends with your neighbor, and your neighbor was an elderly lady, and nobody ever came to check on her, but you always did because she was your friend. And you go and check on her, you'd go and bring her stuff, you know, all these different things, and, you know, one day she passes away. And you go to her funeral, and, you know, none of her kids came, none of her friends came. And because y'all were friends, you had a key to her house. And so nobody ever comes to the house. It's been weeks. The lawn starts growing up, you start cutting it. More weeks go by, you're still cutting the lawn. You go in there and you start checking on the house, just turn off the water, taking care of everything. It's now been a year and you've been taking care of that house. Been 2 years. You've still been taking care of that house. 3 years. Folks, understand, legally you are trespassing. It's not your house. But whoever owns it or doesn't own it has never come to do anything with it. And so you just start treating it like your own, knowing that one day somebody may come and claim it. Well, after 20 years of doing this, her kids show up. And they say, "What are you doing in my mom's house? Get out." You can say, "No, it's mine." And you can go to court and they will grant you the ownership because you can prove that you met this criteria of adverse possession. Please understand that this is a very old school law. You have to understand that once upon a time, people would go off to war. They'd go out west. They'd die of freaking sepsis. All right. And so this law was basically created that if you died, were killed in the Civil War, or anything like this, and you never came back to your property, we're not just going to let property go unowned. You could claim it if somebody abandoned it under these certain circumstances. So it's just a very unique law that was written that allowed you to claim abandoned property. That's it. Now, it is 20 years. That is an exceptionally long time. So this is why it will probably never pan out for you. Now, I read an article not a year ago that somebody actually did get granted ownership of a property some other state by adverse possession. But let me tell you the reason why this is sometimes worthless to ever attempt to go this route. Imagine being on somebody's property for 19 years and they catch wind on the 19th year that you've been in their property. Here's the only thing they have to do to stop you from claiming it. They send you a letter that says, "Hey, thanks so much for taking care of my property like I said you could 19 years ago. I really appreciate it." And then they send you another letter that says, "Get the hell out." Because what they did is they just implied that they gave you permission. And if you had permission, you can never claim ownership. And when they told you to get the hell out, you got to get the hell out. So it is exceptionally hard to meet these criteria. And a lot of times it's not even worth it because of the legal loopholes that you have to go through. I'll give you a real world example of this. The one I gave you is kind of extreme. My nephew's grandpa, okay, not on my side of the family, but on his other side of the family, they had a house in Fuquay, and at the back of their lot was HOA owned property. And the HOA didn't really do much with it, and so they mowed it. They had a trampoline at the back of their lot that was half around the HOA lot. They lived in that house for over 20 years. And when they went to sell it, they talked to an attorney and they said, "Could we steal this land from the HOA and claim it as our own?" The attorney said, "Absolutely you could, because you've met all the criteria. But the value that you would gain versus the court costs it would take you to acquire this piece of land, let it go." So it is just a very unique law that exists. Let me give you one more explanation of this last piece, this color of title. It is 20 years in North Carolina. Now, that's not a universal thing. Involuntary alienation is something that you will absolutely see on the national test, but they shouldn't ask you about the years on the state or the national side because every state has different timings on it. A lot of states it's 20 years, but not all. But let me give you an example of this, or the color of title piece. Color of title means that there is some type of cloud on the title or maybe something that suggests that you should have some ownership of it. And so I'll give you a real world example of this. I told you already that I have a property down in Georgia. That property was family land and I inherited a piece of it and bought out the rest of the people except for my brothers who technically own 1/8 each. But there was another 5-acre parcel of land cut out of my 80 acres that existed on that property. And because of the way that my grandmother's will and everything was written, it wasn't clearly articulated that I was to get or that we were to get that 5 acres. So it was not included. So who got that 5 acres? My mother and her 3 sisters, my aunts. Because it wasn't clear that it was supposed to go to us, even though it was right there in the middle, landlocked, but in the middle. Now, they did nothing with that property for a period of time. And so if I had just waited 7 years for that 5-acre parcel, I could have gone to the courthouse and I could have claimed it and I would have won. Why? Because I had color of title. Something to suggest that I probably should have owned it and they abandoned it. So I would have only had to have met that criteria for 7 years and I could have sold that piece of property. Could have stole it. I didn't do that. I just paid them for it. And then I bought that too. But that would be color of title. There was some documentation to suggest that you have some type of ownership or relationship to this property. It's only 7 years that you have to meet. But otherwise, it's 20 years. That is adverse possession. It is a type of involuntary alienation. Not a common one, but it is testable. Yeah, I agree, Monica. I would have. But yeah, I just did it the easy way, right? I just cut him a check and just bought. I know, shouldn't have, but I did. So let me circle back around to the first one because the adverse possession is the first one that catches everybody's eyes when I flip the slide. So I like to talk about that first. One of the most common types of involuntary alienation is the specific lien foreclosure. So I told you, when you buy a house, you put a lien on your property, a voluntary lien called a mortgage or a deed of trust. Now, we're going to talk about that later. And that gives the banks the right to sell that, foreclose, force the sale of that property if you stop paying them. And so that would be an involuntary alienation. You didn't pay the bank forces the sale of it, and they sell it to somebody else. You've been removed from your ownership. Foreclosure. So specific lien foreclosure is a much more common form of involuntary alienation versus adverse possession. Now, one last note on adverse possession, folks, it's not automatic, or you don't just magically own the property because it's 20 years, but you can say, I'm going to own it, and you can go to court. This would be what we call a suit to quiet title, where you basically go and you argue who should have legal rights or who should legally own it. Now, folks, this is why I told you when we started this section. Just because your name is on a deed at the public record does not mean that you automatically own a property. Because if you've abandoned that property for forever, somebody could have already done a suit to quiet title and stole that property from you. Is it common? No. But can it happen? Yes. Which is why a deed suggests that you're the owner, but doesn't guarantee that you're the owner. So here's that list of ors and es again. Hopefully now some of them are starting to make some sense. We keep talking about grantor and grantee. Those are the parties referenced on a deed. Offeror and offeree we're going to talk about in the contract section. Okay. I just talked about, and this one doesn't have it on the other one. Oh yeah, there we go. Divisor and divisee for the will. But remember, or is always the giver, e is the receivee. So I want to talk about the requirements of a valid deed. Okay, folks, let me preface this. When we are closing on a real estate transaction in today's day and age, they typically include what's called a title search. The title search looks up liens, looks up the past owners, looks at what we call a chain of title. Somebody issues an opinion of title, and so that we know that there's nothing weird about the ownership, that nobody's stolen the property, that, there's nothing kind of odd, because you want to be assured, don't you, that when you buy a house, that you actually legally will own the house? Does that make sense? Yeah, it makes sense to me too. So we do a title search when we're purchasing to make sure that we are going to not have any issues when we own it, and that we will be presumably the new owners and that there's no conflicts there. And so the attorney does the title search, they issue an opinion of title, and then the deed gets recorded in the name of the new owner at closing. And so in North Carolina, we don't even consider you the owner until you record the deed at the Register of Deeds with your name on it, where it shows that transference. I'm going to say this again. In North Carolina, we don't even consider you the owner until you record the deed, or until the deed is recorded that shows that the grantor and the grantee has been updated. But you have to understand that while technically that's how we always do it, and technically while we don't consider you the owner, it's actually not a requirement to record a deed, legally speaking. It would be exceptionally stupid to not record a deed. But it is not a legal requirement for the deed to be valid. Yet again, I want you to understand that what I'm about to tell you falls under some kind of antiquated premise. It still legally exists, but we just don't do it that way. But be very careful on a test question, because if we're asking you what the best practice for a deed is, or what makes a deed enforceable versus valid, that's where you've got to understand what I'm about to get into here. So here's what I mean. When we're dealing with a deed, and a deed being valid, valid is a legal terminology that means it meets all of the criteria under the law. Okay, it meets all the criteria under the law. What it has to have to just exist to be valid. Now, I like this list because I think it's all-encompassing. There are other lists out there that tried to give you an acronym. Unfortunately, I don't think the acronym works great for this because it's confusing. And I'll tell you what I mean in a second. So deeds are required to be in writing. Makes good sense, right? There has to be an actual written document that shows that you transferred ownership to somebody else. So they have to be in writing. We have to have the legal capacity of the grantor. When I say legal capacity, 18, sane, and sober. Same as the criteria for this class. And for this class, remember, 2 out of 3 ain't bad. 18, sane, and sober. Not the grantee, the grantor, the person giving the property. We have to identify the grantor and the grantee on the deed. It has to contain adequate words of conveyance. And you'll see, I'll give you that same example deed. I'll bring it back up in a second. Adequate words of conveyance is, does hereby bargain, exchange, grant, and convey in fee simple or whatever. Okay, it's actual verbiage that conveys it. Has to have that accurate legal description we were talking about earlier on the deed, so there's no confusion about which property is being referenced. Has to be signed by the grantors, not the grantee. And it has to be delivered and voluntarily accepted. Now, the acronym for this is something like, I get paid with every deal. The problem with it is it doesn't line up. Like the paid is supposed to be, the P is, I'll show you the slide. I don't like it. I think it gets confusing. I would rather you just memorize this list versus having these kind of contradictory acronyms that don't really flow well. It's an attempt at one, but it's not a good one. What you got, Sam?
The syllabus mentions escheat, that word, in like this area. Can you just give me one more time, explain what that is?
Yeah, and I think I have a slide for it. And if I don't know why I moved it to a different place, and I might have it as a hidden slide. I've been playing around with them some. Hang tight, and I'll circle back around to escheat. Yeah, I will absolutely get it before the end of the day, though. So let's talk about this what you see on the screen right here, okay? I'm going to paint a picture for you. If I was to draft up a deed on a piece of paper, and I wrote out on it that I was conveying 20 acres to Josh, and I'm 18, sane and sober, so I have the legal capacity to do this. I identified myself as the grantor and Josh as the grantee. I put adequate words of conveyance on there. I put a legal description of the property being conveyed to Josh on there, and I signed it. And then I handed this document to Josh. Does Josh own my property?
No.
No.
Yes, right? Why no?
Does it have consideration?
It's valid.
Legal description of the property.
You gave a accurate legal description, you said, right?
Uh-huh.
Maybe just say that. Skeptics wanted to.
He has to take it and get it recorded.
So here's
Said it
the
does not have to be recorded.
That it was
Yeah, I would
stated
say,
not to
yeah,
be
he owns it.
so this is
Did
why.
you say anything about consideration?
Here's the thing. Deeds are interesting because consideration is not the same as it is on a contract. There typically is consideration, but consideration can be because I want to, because I want to gift it, because I felt like it, for love and affection. There doesn't actually have to be anything of value for a deed to be valid. It can just be this fictitious concept of, what a reason that I wanted to be on there. So let's just say that I wanted to gift it to Josh. That doesn't need to be consideration. Here's the thing. This is why this section sucks so much. Josh owns my property now. If all the valid criteria have been met, Josh owns the property. I told you we don't do it this way. I told you it would be stupid to do it this way. But legally speaking, if all of the essential elements have been met, then it is a valid deed. Legally, Josh owns the property. Now, let me ask you a question. Does anybody know this other than Josh and myself?
No, not with the scenario you gave.
No. And I want to point out another picture here. If one of these was missing, it would be invalidated. So let's say that I did all those things that I just mentioned, but I never gave Josh a copy of this deed. I drafted up a deed saying that I was going to give it to Josh and outlined all of these different things on there. But then I put it in my safe and then I died. And then my kids were cleaning out my safe after I died and they found it. Would Josh own the property?
No, because you didn't give it to him.
Because it was never delivered and voluntarily accepted. If one piece is missing, it's not a valid deed. But you have to understand, folks, yet again, think of antiquated laws the way that deeds have been around for forever. The reason why this is legally accepted as valid is because we didn't used to be right by a courthouse. We didn't used to drive. We didn't used to. Sometimes we would convey land to people just out in the middle of nowhere, and then we would go to the courthouse to record that deed the next chance we got to protect our interest. But that didn't invalidate the fact that we did actually convey property. What you got, Misty?
Oh, shit. What happened? All right, Seth, can you hear me?
Yeah.
All right, so this is the book that you told me to buy, and I did. And on page 76, validity. Following requirements for validity, a deed must be delivered and accepted, and it goes on down, but it says, including consideration, the deed must be accompanied by valuable, monetary, or good love and affection consideration, but the amount need not be reflected the actual price in most cases.
Yes.
So it says, including consideration, that has to be there for it to be valid.
You're absolutely right. And I already said that. I agreed with you. Consideration does have to be on there. But I talk about it separately because it doesn't have to be money. You have to understand it doesn't have to be money. You just read love and affection. That's not money. Wanting to give it to him. I can say, Josh is my boy. That's enough consideration for a deed to be valid. So you're right. There does have to be something on there. It does not have to be money, and it doesn't have to state what it is. Yeah, that's exactly right. It isn't flat currency. It's abstract consideration. And so I like to talk about that separately. But you're absolutely right, Misty. There does need to be some reason for doing it. But it can just be because I like you. Does it make sense?
Well, I'm such a literal person, and going through the book and reading, I mean, like it's like a check mark up.
Yep.
Like that's part of.
And please do think of it that way. I just didn't put it in here yet because I don't want you to think it has to be money. Now, there needs to be something of value, but a deed is absolutely valid. If I was to say, as a gift, you can gift things, and it's still because I wanted to. That would still be a valid deed to gift ownership of a property. When my grandparents got divorced, all of the deeds where they split up their property said for love and affection. That was enough. So just don't think money, but you're right. Consideration is a valid aspect. I just like to talk about it separately because I don't want people to think money. Excellent.
All right, I was like, okay, is
No.
Is the book wrong?
No, the book's not wrong in any way, shape, and form. Consideration is a necessity. Just doesn't have to be money. Absolutely. Kirsten says, why doesn't the grantee need to sign the deed? Because they're just receiving the property, right? Are you going to turn down free property? They have to accept it. They have to acknowledge it. They have to be made aware of it. But we don't need a signature from them. If you look at any deeds, let me show you this real quick. I'm going to pull up that actual deed, and this time you'll see their names because I'm not going to black it out. But I want to pull up that actual deed that I just showed you before. Here you go. I'm going to show you a couple of these pieces that exist. Now, folks, don't get so caught up on this. When we're dealing with valid, if all these things, and the one that's missing is consideration, because I like to talk about it separately. And that's where I'm going to show you the other slide that gives you that acronym. I don't like it, but, some people do. I just don't think it flows as well. But if you look right here, this is an actual recorded deed. Names the grantor, names the grantee, as we said earlier, but only the grantor sign. There is no need for the grantee to sign because they're just, we know that they're getting it. They're told that they're getting it, but they don't need to sign. That's not part of the acknowledgement. They just have to be made aware of it. Now, when I said adequate words of conveyance, I think for this one, it's kind of weird. There we go. Has and by these presents does grant, bargain, sell, and convey unto the grantee in fee simple. Well, there's fee simple, as we said earlier. That means the same as fee simple absolute, but that's the adequate words of conveyance. Now, this is where what happens, Misty. Look right here. For a valuable consideration paid by grantee, the receipt of which is hereby acknowledged. I guarantee you that there was no consideration. It is a requirement to state that there's consideration to make it valid. There doesn't actually have to be any. Does that make sense? So it is a required element. If you were to say nothing on here of value, it would not be a valid deed. But as long as it says there was something of value, it's valid because you don't have to say what it was. And you know how I know that there was no value to this? We're going to talk about transfer tax in just a second. Transfer tax is based on the amount that it was sold for. There's zero, which means there was nothing of value. All they have to do is state there was value. So consideration is an essential element, but it could just be stated that there was value. It could be love and affection. It could be a gift. It could be, nobody's verifying that there's actual consideration, but the document would need to state that. Does that make sense? Yeah. So let's go back to the, just because it is required and stated does not mean it is valid. You mean the consideration, Monica? Yeah. If it was to say something like, I'm giving this to you for free and totally free and nothing in return, it's not going to be a valid deed. You have to at least lie on the deed and state that there was something of value. Yeah. There you go. So here's where this is, kind of an interesting concept from test purposes. And so that's what I told you. If I met all this criteria, and yes, consideration, there wouldn't be need to be something of value on there. whether it was, articulated, monetary, or otherwise, we'd have to state consideration. That is an essential element overall. And if all of this was met with Josh, then he would be the legal owner of the property. But the problem is, as I mentioned before, nobody knows that Josh is the legal owner of the property. So if my deed where I got the property is recorded, but Josh's isn't, and you go down to the courthouse and you look up the current deed, who does it look like owns the property?
You.
Me. Do you see the problem here? What would happen in that scenario? Let's say that Josh leaves and immediately I meet with Monica. And I offer to sell this property to Monica. And she looks at the public record and it says I own it. She gives me money for it and I just write up a new deed and transfer it to her. Well, folks, I just committed fraud. And if you can find me, I'm going to jail. So is a deed valid if it meets these criteria, lacking consideration, right? It has to have consideration, but it's not on this slide. It's on a future one I'm going to show you. Yes, it's valid. But you're not protecting yourself. And so we record it to make it enforceable against third-party claims. So the rest of the world knows that you are now the owner of record, the presumed to be owner. The recordation serves as public notice or constructive notice, telling the public that the ownership has changed. There you go. When we're dealing with North Carolina, I told you North Carolina and some other states is what we call a pure race state. And so let's say that I sold the property fraudulently to both Josh and Monica, and they both had deeds. And Josh went out to celebrate, and Monica went straight to the courthouse and recorded. They're going to look at the public record, and they're going to say, oh, Seth is the current owner of record. That's who signed this, and they're going to record it. Monica's going to be the owner. When Josh goes to record his deed, they're going to say, sucks to suck, Chuck. Monica owns this property, not Seth. I don't know where you got this deed, but he's not the owner. So you can see why we would never want to operate that way. Especially when you're spending $300, $400, $500, $600,000. This is why we do title searches and record to protect our interest immediately. But that doesn't mean a deed isn't valid if it's not recorded. We record to protect against third-party interest. Now, I'm going to circle back around because, I want this concept to be kind of the one we pick back up on Monday. So I'm going to circle back around before I go any deeper into this, and I show you the other versions of the slide with like the I get paid with every deal acronym that I don't necessarily love, and then the full picture. But I want to circle back around and I want to answer Sam's question so I don't forget as we're coming down to the wire here. So and I think I must just have it hidden because I've been reworking all these slides because of all these test changes. And I've been trying to formulate them differently as I've been seeing things come out. But Sam asked what escheat was. And so let me just circle back around to that. Escheat is another type of involuntary alienation. Okay. Involuntary alienation, as we said, is when you are removed from your ownership without permission. There are going to be slides in here. I just maybe moved them in the wrong place because there's two that we haven't talked about. The other two types of involuntary alienation is escheat and eminent domain. Escheat is when, think of it this way, you died intestate. What does that mean? Dying intestate.
Without a will?
Without a will. And so the state that you're in creates a will for you under the law of intestate succession. And after they go down the list, you don't have anybody to give it to. Well, they're not just going to let it sit there. So the state is going to take it. It's called escheat. Think of it as the government or the state cheats you out of your property. That's, not necessarily what happened. You died and you didn't have any people. That's on you, boo-boo. But technically, that's what happens. If you die without a will and the state has nobody to give it to, they will take your property and they will auction it off, and that money will go towards public schools. That's called escheat. And so I use that example whenever I was talking about the Dorothea Dix, when the fee simple to feasible, more specifically the determinable estates, right? But eminent domain is another type of involuntary alienation. I'm I'm sorry, Dora. What's your question? You don't have one? Well, let me finish eminent domain and then I'll circle back around to that question, Monica. Eminent domain, we'll see a slide for it. Eminent domain is the right of the government to take your land for the greater good. So if you're in the Triangle area, as most of you are, you know about the Highway 540. Folks, there was not empty space where that is. They have torn down many houses, businesses, and otherwise. And so they just showed up and they knocked on people's doors and they said, here's a check. You're out in 8 months because we're demoing your house and we're putting a highway here. That is eminent domain. Eminent domain is a type of involuntary alienation where the government has the right to take your property for the greater good. They do have to pay you just and fair compensation for it. And then, of course, depending on the state, like North Carolina is what we call a right to take state. You cannot contest that they are taking it from you. You can argue with how much they're going to give you and go to court over it. But here's the thing that you may or may not know. You have to get permission from the government to sue the government for more money. So you have to basically go and say, can I take you to court and ask for more money? And they say, let me think about it. Nope. And if they say no, then you can't take them to court. But if they say yes, then you can take them to court. It's the stupidest thing ever. But eminent domain is the right to take the land for the greater good. The act of actually taking it is called condemnation. And I will give you slides for this when we pick back up next week. I just, for whatever reason, they're out of order, and I apologize. I'll fix it. So it's called condemnation. Now, to circle back around to Monica's question, probate is a term that could absolutely be on the test. Yeah, which probate is just, the act of looking over a deceased person's estate and, making sure that all wishes and things can be upheld and divvying out the property, and it goes through a process. So that's really the probate in a nutshell.
Would not be posed as one of the states that we go through before they decide on how to partition the estate. It goes to probate. It goes through your wills. I'm just wondering if they would differ.
No, they're not going to go into in-depth conversations about probate. That's just you could see the word in context of talking about a property that maybe is going to bypass probate. So, like for example, in that deed that we just looked at, that's going to bypass probate because it has that life estate. So probate is irrelevant in that because it will automatically, upon death, go straight to those grantees. So no probate needed. So you may see something like that. Which type of ownership would bypass probate? A conventional life estate with a remainder man named. It's very clearly identified in the deed what's going to happen upon somebody's death. And so probate would be irrelevant. Yeah, excellent question. I'll tell you a crazy story about eminent domain just to wrap up before I let you just ask questions on whatever. Because we've got a very, very important concept that I'll kick off Monday with called the statute of frauds. But eminent domain, if you never saw this, there was actually an instance in Cary. Here's the crazy thing about it. Cary Parkway, I believe it was. They expanded Cary Parkway, and so the government came by, and they didn't take everybody's whole property. They took like the front 15 feet or 10 feet or something to widen the road in Cary Parkway. And when they did that, they changed the impervious surface, and it actually caused one of the homeowners to get a lot of water runoff when it rained, and it caused their house to flood. So the government fought them to the nail. They had to go back and they had to complain that they basically ruined their house and made it unusable, but they paid them minuscule amounts of money to just take the first little bit of frontage of their property. Well, the government kept refusing to hear it, kept kicking it down kicking the can down the road, and then eventually what this homeowner did, it was a big white house in Cary on Cary Parkway, and so in big red paint on the front of his house, he put "Screwed by the City of Cary." He painted it in giant letters on the outside of his house. So every single person who drove Cary Parkway saw that house. And eventually the news team got a hold of it and it became a big snafu. And then, of course, they finally heard it and it went to court. Now, here's the really sad part about this. It was an older man that lived there. He died before it ever came to fruition. But he did win post-mortem. He died, but then won. Yeah, so That's eminent domain for you. I think he had kids, so I think his kids got the money. You know, if I'm remembering correctly, but yeah, that was a whole thing. So eminent domain. Some states you can contest their right to take it. Other states you can't. Like I said, North Carolina is a right to take state. All you can contest is how much money they're giving you. But they do typically give you what they think is just and fair compensation because they don't want to battle you in court. So they just say, take the check, shut up, go away. They can't just take it for free. You have to pay for it. That's right. Folks, as per usual, actually, let me do this. Let me show you. Y'all hang tight. Y'all ask me whatever you want to ask me in the last 10 minutes, and I will give you some insight into the draft version of the Relink book and the draft version of the syllabus.
We only have class Monday and Tuesday next week, correct?
Is Wednesday a holiday?
Wednesday is Valentine's Day.
Valentine's Day. Yeah, it's Valentine's Day. It's not a federally recognized holiday, but here's the thing. I didn't want any of you getting divorces over pre-licensing class. So we elected to give you the night off on Wednesday. So you are correct. You do not have class on Wednesday. I just, you know, I didn't want any of y'all getting in trouble.
Monica said too late.
Oh, touche. Well, I didn't want you getting a divorce over the class, but if you already had one, you know, then you just have a me day on Valentine's Day, right? Like that's, yeah. We'll just call it a, you know, yeah, right. Not divorce number 2. That's right. Then you just have a me day, drink some champagne, okay, live your best life, you know, get a pedicure or something.
I agree.
Yeah. So yes, correct. There is no class on Wednesday. I had to think about it. All my days run together.
I figured you did it so you wouldn't get in trouble.
Oh no, I don't. I'm past that point. Listen, I used to work as a restaurant manager, and so I worked every holiday known to man for the longest time. Oops, what did I just do?
Well, my wedding anniversary is the 11th, so Valentine's Day is just another day.
So there you go. My computer is doing crazy things. Maybe that's it. So yeah, it wasn't for me. I was just, you know, worried about enrollments and y'all. But yeah, it's off. Wait, you thought I looked familiar, Monica? Is this a good familiar or a bad familiar? It wasn't me, okay? Whatever it wasn't me. I didn't do it. You can't prove it.
I think she's talking about because you said you used to...
Yeah, from the restaurant? No, I knew what she meant. I was being funny. Oh, there you go. Hotel from class, for class. That'll be fun. Here we go. Here is... Let me find it. They just shared it with us today. 2024. Well, y'all can ask me other questions. I know how to multitask. What else do y'all want to ask me in the last 4 minutes of class? Why can't I find this? Do they not share it? Nobody has any other questions at all?
No, right now I feel good about everything, so hopefully.
So far, so good. There you go. What you got, Adriana?
Can you explain again when you said a will cannot override survivorship in the dead?
Yes, a will cannot override survivorship in a deed. If you and I owned a property together as joint tenants with right of survivorship, well, that survivorship means that if one of us dies, the other one automatically absorbs our share, right? So if I die, you absorb my share. If you die, I absorb your share because of this right of survivorship. So I may own half of this property, but then in my will, I put that I want my half of this property to go to my first son. And so that's what Monica and I were talking about. When I die, probate will take a look at my will and they will say, okay, well, the last will and testament of Seth Chauncey says he wanted the half of his ownership in this property to go to his son. But that cannot be upheld because of the right of survivorship. Adriana is now the sole owner of that property. And so that will be ignored within his will. Because it's not mine to give. When I died, it all went to you. That make sense?
Yeah, well, yes.
I hope so.
It's will.
But it's not mine to will. Folks, I'm going to give you a very nerdy reference, okay? And some of you are going to understand this and some of you are not. And those of you who listen, okay? Nobody needs to know whether you like it or not. How many of y'all have seen the Harry Potter movies? Everybody? A lot of you? There's a scene in the Harry Potter movies towards the end where, spoiler alert if you haven't seen it, Dumbledore dies, okay? And then the Minister of Magic comes and he gives crap to all of the kids in the movies. And at one point in it, he gives Harry Potter this one thing, and then he basically says, he wanted to leave you the sword of Gryffindor as well. And then he's like, well, it's not his to give. You can't leave somebody something that's not yours. And because I was not set to own it anymore when I died, it wasn't mine to give. Because it was yours after I died. Does that make sense?
Yes.
It'd be like me dying and saying, my kids get Corey's house. Is anybody going to go steal Corey's house when I die and give it to my kids? No. See what I'm saying? So it wasn't mine to give. It wasn't willable. I didn't have the right to will it because we knew that when I died, you would absorb my share.
If the person draws a will legally with an attorney, so the attorney will be able to tell him, you cannot.
Well, the attorney is probably just going to write whatever you tell him to write in there. They're not necessarily going to do full-fledged title searches. They'll write whatever you want in there. By the way, you don't need an attorney to write a will. You could write your own will and have it notarized and put it in your safe, and it still can be upheld. So you don't have to have an attorney to write your own will. It's a good idea to have an attorney write a will, though. Don't get it twisted. But, folks, I'm going to put it in the chat. Take it with a grain of salt. That's right, man. Monica says attorneys are coin operated. Don't think too much of them. Yeah, that's not a bad way to put it. Was your ex an attorney? Was this? No, he wasn't. Here is the updated Relink book, folks. Now, as I said, it is called Draft for a reason, but all of this stuff will apply. Oops, I just sent it to Monica directly by accident. I'm sorry, Monica. Let me put it back in the chat. All of this stuff in here will basically pertain to you because none of you will be taking the PSI exam. Our class doesn't end until after March starts. So this is basically going to be your testing process. It's going to be your, kind of question breakdown and everything that I put in there. Now, like I said, take it with a grain of salt, but I want you to be well informed. So there is your new, mostly updated version of your Relink book. The syllabus I will give you on Monday because I haven't had a chance to read through it. And I just want to make sure that it's not going to freak you out before I share it with you. But I do have the updated version of the syllabus. It's not changing any of the material I'm teaching you folks, though. It's the same material, just restructured to kind of go hand in hand with the testable topics within the Relink book. So there you go. Ask and you shall receive.